The day I decided to go camping by myself was supposed to be a quiet retreat from the noise of everyday life. I had planned it for weeks, looking forward to escaping the constant buzz of the city. I was looking for peace, some time alone to reflect, to think, and maybe to figure out some of the mess in my life. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just some time in nature, away from the chaos. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, food, and enough water to last me for a couple of days. I left early in the morning, eager to get to the campsite. The drive out to the wilderness was long, the kind of drive where the roads stretch on, and the world around you seems to disappear. As I passed the last small town, I felt a sense of liberation. I was out of reach of everything. The open road was all I had, and the feeling was good. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The air was crisp, the sky a bright blue with only a few puffy clouds scattered across. The trail was quiet. A few other cars were parked along the road, but there weren't many people around. I liked it that way. I grabbed my backpack and started walking into the woods. The hike was about an hour to the campsite I had picked out. It was located near a small stream, surrounded by trees and not too far from a ridge that gave a nice view of the valley below. I'd done my research, read reviews from others who had camped there before, and everything seemed perfect. Nothing too remote, but still far enough to feel like I was truly out in the wild. Setting up my tent was quick, and once I was done, I went to gather some firewood. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and the shadows grew longer. It wasn't dark yet, but the quiet was already starting to set in, and I couldn't help but notice how still everything was. There were no birds calling, no squirrels chattering, not even a breeze rustling the leaves. It was unnervingly silent. I brushed it off, though. I'd been hiking for a while, and my body was aching, so I focused on making sure the fire was ready to go for when the evening chill set in. As night began to fall, I started the fire and sat by it, watching the flames dance. The crackling of the wood was the only sound, and for a while it was calming. I heated up a can of chili I had brought and ate slowly, savoring the warmth. Afterward, I leaned back against a tree and looked up at the stars. There was no light pollution out here, and the night sky was breathtaking. I found myself getting lost in the constellations. Then that's when I first heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound in the distance, like a twig snapping. I froze, my body going rigid. Could have been an animal, I thought. Probably a deer or something. But then there was another sound, closer this time, like footsteps on the forest floor. I tried to dismiss it. There were other campers around. It could have been someone else out for a walk. But the longer I listened, the more I felt the unease creeping in. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the camp, the firelight flickering and casting long shadows. There was no one in sight. I wasn't sure if it was the dark or the isolation that was making me paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and shone it around the campsite. The beam of light pierced the darkness, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably nothing. But then the footsteps came again. This time they were closer, unmistakable. Someone was out there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I made my way to the edge of the camp, trying to peer into the darkness. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing. Just silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. If it was a person, I didn't want to confront them alone. But if it was some animal, I didn't want to make noise and attract it either. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening, straining for any sign of movement. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and all I was left with was the eerie quiet of the woods. I decided to go back to the fire and try to forget about it. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal. I couldn't let myself get worked up over nothing. But as I sat back down, the fire crackling softly in front of me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt heavy, and the silence felt oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But every snap of a twig, every gust of wind that sent the trees swaying, made my heart race. I stayed up late that night, too afraid to sleep, my eyes darting toward every sound, waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. The next morning, I woke up stiff and exhausted. The sun had just risen, casting long shadows over the campsite. I could still feel the weight of the night's fear lingering in the back of my mind. The woods looked different in the daylight. What had seemed so peaceful and serene yesterday now felt more ominous. I packed up my things quickly, eager to get out of the woods. But as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. At the edge of my camp, near where I had set up my tent, there was a set of footprints. They were fresh, the dirt still soft from the night's moisture, and they led away from the camp, disappearing into the trees. The footprints were too big to be from an animal. Human footprints, barefoot, as if someone had walked right up to my camp in the middle of the night. My stomach dropped. There was no way I could have missed someone walking up to my tent. I would have heard them, but these prints were clear. Someone had been there, and I had no idea who or why. The idea of staying another night in that camp felt unbearable. I didn't even want to stick around to see who might come back. I hurriedly packed up the rest of my things and started down the trail, my mind racing with questions. Who had been out there, and why? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just some lost hiker or someone who had wandered too close to my camp. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. As I reached the trailhead and finally stepped into the parking area, I felt a sense of relief. The car was in sight, the open road waiting. But as I walked toward it, I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second, to see if anyone else was coming down the trail. That's when I saw it. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. Person watching me. Their face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart stopped. I turned quickly and got in my car, locking the doors before I even sat down. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. The image of that figure still burned into my mind. It wasn't until I got home that I felt I could finally breathe again. Safe. I hadn't seen the person again, but the memory of their presence, of those footprints, would stay with me. Weeks passed, and the memory started to fade, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, still watching. The strange thing is, I never saw that figure again. But I found something in the mail one day, a single crumpled note with no return address. It was simple, just a few words written in block letters. Next time, don't leave so early. And I never went camping alone again. I needed a break from everything. Work, traffic, the endless noise of the city. I had been feeling drained for months, so when I finally got a long weekend off, I decided to get away. A cabin in the woods sounded perfect. Somewhere quiet with no distractions. Just me, nature, and some time to clear my head. I found a place online. It was deep in the woods, far from any town. Exactly what I wanted. The listing described it as rustic but well-kept, with no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and no neighbors for miles. That sounded perfect to me. The owner sent me detailed directions since GPS wouldn't work that deep in the forest. I packed my bag with enough supplies for a few days and set out early Friday morning. The drive started out normal. Highways turned into back roads, then narrower roads surrounded by dense trees. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I was on a gravel road. Then the gravel turned to dirt. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. No houses, no gas stations, no sign of people. Just endless trees pressing in on either side of the road. I followed the instructions carefully, taking slow turns where the owner had warned me about unmarked paths. After what felt like hours, I spotted the cabin at the end of a barely visible trail. It was small, with dark wooden walls and a slanted roof. A wraparound porch creaked as I stepped onto it. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Everything was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness. I brushed it off and unlocked the door. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch facing the fireplace, and a dusty bookshelf in the corner. The windows were small, letting in only a little light. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my bag by the couch and walked around. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. There were a few old hunting photos on the walls, a couple of shelves with random books, and a fireplace stacked with wood. I checked my phone. No signal as expected. That was fine. I wasn't here to scroll through my phone anyway. I took a deep breath and sat down, letting the silence settle over me. As the sun set, the cabin grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace and made a simple meal. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls. The quiet started to feel normal, even relaxing. I read for a while, then stretched out on the couch, listening to the crackling fire. For the first time in a long time, I felt calm. Then, late at night, I heard it. A soft noise outside. Faint, but distinct. Rustling leaves. Like footsteps. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, everything was silent again. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the sound made me uneasy. It had been steady, deliberate, not the random scurrying of a small creature. I shook my head and went to bed, locking the door behind me. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, leaving the room dim. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping against the cabin wall. It was slow, deliberate, like fingers running along the wood. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window. The glass reflected nothing but darkness. I waited, heart pounding. The sound stopped. For a long time, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any movement. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so paranoid. I stepped outside with my coffee, stretching. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The footprints didn't circle the cabin. They stopped near my bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been standing there, watching. I went back inside and locked the door. My mind raced. There were no other cabins nearby, no roads leading past mine. Who would be out here? I checked my phone again. Still no service. I considered leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe it was a hunter who had wandered too close. Maybe it was a prank. I forced myself to stay calm. The rest of the day was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked the locks. I kept the fire going, wanting as much light as possible. I sat on the couch, listening. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. Tap, light, hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. The window was small, the glass fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. Every creak, every shift of the fire made me jump. I didn't sleep. I barely blinked. When the first light of morning came, I had already decided. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care about the money I had spent. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me all night. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The road felt longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing, I will never go back to that cabin again. I had been looking for a quiet place to get away for a while. Life had been too noisy, work, the city, people. I wanted to be alone, just for a few days, somewhere peaceful, somewhere deep in nature where no one could reach me. I found a cabin listed online, far from any town, deep in the woods. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no distractions. Just me, the cabin, and silence. The drive was long. The further I went, the more the roads narrowed. Asphalt turned to gravel, then dirt. I passed a few scattered houses at first, then nothing. Just miles of trees on either side of the road. I followed the directions carefully, making sure I didn't miss any turns. The last stretch was barely a road at all, just a narrow trail with deep tire grooves winding through dense trees. It felt like I was going somewhere forgotten by the world. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly as I had expected. Small, weathered, with a slanted roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. The wood looked old but solid. The windows were small, the kind that barely let in any light. It sat alone at the end of the trail, surrounded by nothing but thick forest. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of people, nothing but trees and the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The air smelled fresh, earthy, untouched. But there was something else, something strange. It was quiet, too quiet. I expected birds, maybe the distant rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. But there was nothing, just complete stillness. I brushed it off. I had been in the city for too long. Maybe I just wasn't used to real silence anymore. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. The inside was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch facing the fireplace, a dusty bookshelf against one wall. It smelled like wood and age. The walls were lined with old hunting photos, black and white pictures of men holding up deer, rifles slung over their shoulders. A few shelves held random books, their covers faded with time. The first thing I did was check my phone. No service. I had expected that, but it still made me feel a little uneasy. It was strange knowing that if something happened, I had no way of calling for help. But I told myself that was the point of this trip. No distractions, just me and the quiet. I spent the rest of the evening settling in. I stacked the firewood left by the owner, started a small fire in the fireplace, and made a simple meal. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. I sat on the couch, listening to the silence. It was strange at first, unsettling, but I told myself I would get used to it. Then I heard something outside, faint rustling. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, nothing. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer. I shook my head, forcing myself to relax. I had been in the city for too long. My mind was just playing tricks on me. I went to bed, making sure to lock the door, though I doubted anyone was out here. Who would be this deep in the woods? I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, the room dim. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. Slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight, pointed it at the window, but the glass reflected nothing but the faint glow of the embers. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so on edge. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking in the fresh air. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw them, footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The footprints didn't go all the way around the cabin. They stopped near my bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping. I went back inside and locked the door. My thoughts raced. Who would be out here? There were no roads past mine, no other cabins nearby. I checked my phone again. No service. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe just some local messing around. I forced myself to push the fear away. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked the locks, made sure the fire was big enough to last a while. I sat on the couch, listening. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it. Tap, light, hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. My hands gripped the armrest of the couch. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the fire made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things in record time, barely even stopping to eat. I didn't care if I had paid for another night. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, fresh ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. The road seemed longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I won't ever go back to that cabin again. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend. I needed time away from everything: work, people, the constant noise of the city. The thought of being completely alone in nature with no distractions sounded perfect. I found a place online, an old but well-maintained cabin that was far from any town, surrounded by nothing but forest. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the woods, and some peace and quiet. The drive out was long. The roads got narrower the further I went, turning from paved to gravel, then finally to dirt. The last stretch had no signs, just a winding path through thick trees. I followed the directions carefully and eventually spotted the cabin, sitting alone at the end of the trail. It was small, with a slanted roof and a wraparound porch. The wood was dark and weathered, but everything looked sturdy. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my bags. The air smelled fresh, the way only deep woods can. Everything was still and quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No wind through the trees, just an eerie silence. I brushed it off and unlocked the door, stepping inside. The place was simple: one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. There was an old wooden table with 2 chairs, a dusty bookshelf, and a single couch facing the fireplace. The windows were small, and the only light came from the dim bulbs powered by a generator. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I set my bags down and walked around, getting a feel for the place. The wooden floors creaked under my feet. The walls had old hunting photos and a few shelves with random books. The bed was small but looked comfortable enough. I checked my phone, no service. I expected that. The rental listing had warned about it. I took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, letting the silence settle in. It felt strange at first, but I told myself I would get used to it. As night fell, the cabin grew colder. I started a fire in the fireplace, using the stack of wood left by the owner. The flames flickered, casting shadows across the walls. I made a simple meal, ate by the fire, then stretched out on the couch with a book. The stillness of the place was almost soothing now. No emails, no traffic noise, just the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wood. Then I heard something outside, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up, listening. The fire popped, but beyond that, everything was still. I shook my head and went back to my book, convincing myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. When I went to bed, I made sure the door was locked, though I doubted anyone was out there. Who would be this deep in the woods? I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned low, and the room was dim. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. It was slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it at the window, but the glass reflected nothing but the faint glow of the embers. I waited, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I felt silly for being so on edge. I stepped outside with my coffee, taking in the fresh air. The ground was damp from the night's dew. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the trees to the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The footprints didn't go all the way around the cabin. They stopped near the bedroom window. My chest tightened. Someone had been outside while I was sleeping, close enough to touch the walls. I looked back at the footprints, trying to judge their size. They were normal, too normal. Not boots, not hiking shoes. Just regular footprints, like someone had been walking barefoot. I went back inside and locked the door. My thoughts raced. Who would be out here? There were no other cabins nearby, no roads leading anywhere past mine. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I thought about leaving, but I had paid for the full weekend, and it seemed ridiculous to run just because of some footprints. Maybe some local had wandered by. Maybe it was a prank. I forced myself to push the fear away. The rest of the day was quiet. I stayed near the cabin, not wanting to go too deep into the woods. As the sun started to set, I double-checked all the locks and made sure the fire was big enough to last a while. I sat on the couch, listening. Nothing. The forest was silent again. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it. Tap. Light, almost hesitant, against the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly. My breath caught in my throat. The window was small, the glass slightly fogged from the cold air inside. I couldn't see anything out there. Another tap. My hands gripped the armrest of the couch. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. I stayed awake all night. I didn't sleep, didn't even close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Every creak of the wood, every shift of the fire made me jump. When the first light of morning came, I had already made up my mind. I packed my things in record time, barely even stopping to eat. I didn't care if I had paid for another night. I was leaving. As I loaded my bag into the car, I looked at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something that made my breath catch. The footprints from the night before, they were gone. But there were new ones, fresh ones, leading from the cabin back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in my car and drove, not looking back. The road seemed longer this time, the trees pressing in on either side. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, my hands were shaking on the wheel. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I won't ever go back to that cabin again. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything: work, city life, the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment window. I found a secluded camping spot deep in the national forest, far from any popular trails. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near a small river that I had found on an old map. It seemed perfect. No people, no noise, just the woods and me. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed a dirt road that eventually turned into an overgrown path. I parked my truck at the side and hiked the rest of the way in. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched under my boots as I pushed through thick brush, carrying my pack and gear. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to the river to hear the water, but far enough away that I wouldn't wake up soaked in morning mist. After getting a small fire going, I cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and beef jerky. The quiet was comforting. I had missed this feeling of being alone in nature, away from everything. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had camped alone before. I knew the noises of the forest. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I lay still, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, too heavy for a small animal, but too light for a bear. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming the beam outside my tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I listened for a while longer, but the sound was gone. Probably just a deer, I told myself. I zipped my sleeping bag up tighter and forced myself to relax. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Maybe I had imagined it, half asleep in the middle of the night. I shook it off and spent the day hiking, exploring the area, collecting firewood. By sunset, I was tired but content. I made another fire, ate dinner, and sat by the flames, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I turned quickly, my flashlight cutting through the night. Still nothing. I stood up, scanning the tree line. My skin prickled. Someone was out there, watching. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and kept it close as I crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise had me wide awake, gripping the handle of my hatchet. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, I heard something that turned my blood cold. A deep, steady breathing, just outside my tent. I held my breath, my mind racing. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Whoever or whatever was out there stood just inches from the thin fabric separating us. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard slow footsteps retreating into the woods. I waited until the sun came up before unzipping my tent. My hands were shaking. I stepped outside and scanned the area. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into my pack, my heart still hammering. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked back to my truck, every snap of a twig making me jump. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe just some stranger messing with me, maybe something worse. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. The idea was simple: spend a few nights deep in the wilderness, away from all the noise of the city. I packed everything I needed: a tent, food, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a survival knife. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. I found the perfect spot on a map, a remote area near a lake, surrounded by dense forest. The plan was to hike about 10 miles into the woods, set up camp, and just enjoy the solitude. The first day was uneventful. I parked my truck at the trailhead and started hiking. The air was fresh, and the forest was thick. I followed a narrow trail that had probably not been used in months. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and occasionally, I heard the distant sound of running water. I walked for hours, stopping only to take sips of water and adjust my backpack. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near the lake. It was perfect: flat ground, enough space to set up my tent, and a great view of the water. I set up my tent quickly, then gathered firewood. As the sun dipped below the trees, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The night was calm, just the sounds of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. After eating, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, feeling at peace. Around midnight, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was completely silent. That was strange. The woods are never truly quiet at night. There's always something moving, an animal rustling through leaves or a breeze shifting the branches. But this was absolute silence. I listened for a while, heart pounding, but eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a cold breeze. The silence from the night before still bothered me, but I brushed it off. I made some coffee, ate a protein bar, and decided to explore the area. I walked along the edge of the lake, taking in the beauty of the place. The water was still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. Felt untouched, like no one had been here in years. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. They were deep, made by someone wearing boots, and they led from the woods to the edge of the water. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared near the shore. There were no return prints. It was as if whoever made them had walked into the lake and never come back out. I stood there for a long time, staring at the calm water. It didn't make sense. I shook off the unease and continued my day. Maybe it was an old camper. Maybe I had missed the return tracks. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, I made sure my fire was bigger, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at a distance. I stayed up late, listening. At around 2 a.m., I heard something. A single snap of a branch close. Too close. I turned my flashlight towards the sound, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. I barely slept that night. Every little sound made me jolt awake. The first light, I decided to pack up and leave. As I stepped out of my tent, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt, leading up to my tent. Deep boot prints. Someone had been standing just outside while I was sleeping. My stomach turned. I grabbed my knife, packed everything in record time, and started hiking back. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear movement behind me, but every time I turned around, there was nothing. I walked faster. The trail felt longer than before. My mind raced with thoughts. Who was out there? What did they want? I pushed forward, refusing to stop until I reached my truck. When I finally saw it, parked exactly where I had left it, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I tossed my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Just standing there, watching. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe a hermit, maybe someone with bad intentions. All I know is that I was not alone in those woods, and I never want to be that close to the unknown again. I had been planning the solo camping trip for months. Work had been stressful, and I needed to get away from everything for a while. Just me, the woods, and the sound of nothing. I picked a spot deep in the forest, away from the popular trails where families and casual hikers went. I wanted real isolation, the kind where you don't see another person for days. I checked the weather forecast, packed enough supplies for a week, and made sure to let my brother know where I'd be. If anything went wrong, at least one person would know where to look for me. The drive to the forest was long, but I enjoyed the time alone. The last stretch of the trip was on an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became. Tree branches scraped against the sides of my truck, and potholes shook the whole vehicle. Eventually, I reached the spot I had marked on my map, a clearing near a slow-moving river. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, exactly what I had been looking for. I spent the first day setting up camp. I pitched my tent close to the tree line for extra cover and set up a fire pit a few feet away. I collected enough firewood to last a couple of nights, filtered some water from the river, and made myself a simple meal. The sun set behind the trees, and soon, I was left with nothing but the glow of my fire and the sound of the river. Felt good to be away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, just nature. That first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of rustling outside my tent, but it was probably just a raccoon or some other small animal. In the morning, I took a short hike to explore the area. I found old signs of human activity, remains of an old fire pit, a rusted tin can, and what looked like the collapsed remains of a small wooden structure. Maybe an old hunter's shack. It had been there for decades, covered in moss and almost completely hidden by the forest. The second night, things felt different. As I sat by the fire, I noticed how quiet the woods had become. No crickets, no owls, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound you make. My breathing, the crackling of the fire, the occasional pop of burning wood, it all felt louder. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something out in the trees. A faint, deliberate sound. Not an animal moving through the underbrush, but something stepping carefully, trying to stay quiet. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, but all I saw were shadows. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself to go to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made my heart pound. I must have drifted off eventually, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized my fire was out. I was sure I had put enough wood on it before going to bed, but now it was nothing but smoldering embers. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, careful. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. I reached for the knife I always kept with me, gripping it tightly. I stayed completely still, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, just when I thought whoever was out there had left, I heard something worse. The slow, deliberate sound of a zipper being pulled. My tent's zipper. I shot up, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it straight at the door of my tent. Nothing. The zipper was untouched, exactly as I had left it. But I knew what I had heard. I sat there, my heart pounding, gripping my knife so hard my hand ached. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up camp. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was out there. As I loaded my gear into my truck, I looked around one last time, and then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints circling my campsite. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone had been out there watching me. I got into my truck and drove out of there as fast as the rough road would allow. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out to stretch my legs, still shaken by what had happened. As I stood there, trying to calm myself, I noticed something on the side of my truck. A single, deep scratch running along the driver's side door. I don't know who was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I had planned the trip for months. A solo camping trip deep in the national forest, away from crowded campsites and noisy tourists. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. I had checked the weather, packed everything I needed, and mapped out the route. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway from the stress of work and city life. The first day went exactly as I had hoped. I parked my truck at a trailhead about 20 miles from the nearest paved road, shouldered my pack, and started the hike. The forest was dense, full of towering pines and thick underbrush. The trail was narrow but well-trodden, winding through the hills. Birds called overhead, and every now and then, I'd see a rabbit or a deer dart through the trees. After about 6 miles of hiking, I found a clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, plenty of firewood, and the sound of running water nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a small fire. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat back, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the quiet of the woods. The first night was peaceful. I slept well, only waking up once when I heard something rustling outside the tent. Probably just a raccoon or a deer passing through. I wasn't worried. The next morning, I boiled some water for coffee and cooked a quick breakfast. The air was crisp, and the forest smelled like pine and damp earth. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream for a while and climbing a small ridge to get a better view of the valley. Everything was perfect. But that evening, things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, finishing my dinner, when I got the strange sense that I wasn't alone. That feeling you get when someone is watching you. I glanced around, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I kept looking over my shoulder. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside made me tense up. The wind moving through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just animals. That's what forests sound like at night. But something felt wrong. Sometime around midnight, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. These were slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath, listening. The steps were coming from the trees just beyond my camp. I reached for my flashlight and shined it in that direction, but there was nothing, just trees. The footsteps had stopped the second I turned on the light. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked the area around my tent. I half expected to find footprints, but there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get the best of me. I told myself I was being paranoid and decided to stay another night. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. That sensation of being watched never went away. That night, I made sure my fire was big and bright. I ate my dinner quickly, scanning the darkness around me. As I was getting ready to crawl into my tent, I heard something. A whistle. A low, sharp whistle, coming from deep in the trees. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was human. I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. Then, from a different direction, another whistle. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. And whoever it was, they weren't making noise by accident. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my knife in my hand, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear something moving in the woods. Not an animal, something bigger. I kept the fire going as long as I could, but eventually, I ran out of wood. As the fire died down, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife tighter, my breath shallow. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, my nerves on edge, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sky started to lighten, and the forest slowly came alive with the sounds of birds and insects. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back felt different. Every little sound made me jump. I kept checking behind me, convinced I wasn't alone. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in the back and locked the doors. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. I never found out who was out there that night. I never saw them, but I know they were there, and they were watching me. I had been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Work had been stressful, and I needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I chose a remote location deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I didn't want to deal with other campers. I wanted silence, just me and nature. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads before I reached the rough dirt path leading to the forest. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, grabbed my gear, and started hiking in. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles in, set up camp by a small river I had seen on the map, and spend a few nights unwinding. I had packed enough supplies, food, water, a sturdy tent, and my hunting knife, just in case. The hike in was peaceful at first. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I felt good, away from the noise of the city. But about 5 miles in, I started feeling uneasy. There was no obvious reason for it. No strange noises, no signs of anything off, but something about the silence felt wrong. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and boots crunching against the dirt. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that feeling of being watched never left. I reached the river just before sunset and quickly set up my tent. The river was exactly as I had imagined, calm, clear, and surrounded by thick trees. I filtered some water, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. As darkness settled in, I felt that uneasiness return. It was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear owls or crickets by now, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. A sound woke me up in the middle of the night. It was faint, like something moving through the trees. I lay still, listening. It wasn't the wind. There was a deliberate pattern to it, like footsteps. Slow, careful steps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. About 30 feet from my campsite, there were footprints. Human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I packed up immediately. My plan was to leave right away, but as I looked at the trail I had come from, something felt wrong. The footprints weren't just near my tent. They led back into the forest. And worse, they weren't alone. There were more prints now, like multiple people had been walking around. The realization sent a chill through me. I wasn't alone out here. I kept my knife in my hand as I started walking back. I moved quickly, but carefully, keeping my eyes on the trees around me. Every now and then, I heard something, branches snapping, faint rustling in the distance. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. I forced myself to stay calm. Running would be a mistake. I could twist my ankle, get lost, or make too much noise. But I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The sounds behind me grew louder, more frequent. Whoever they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Then I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree ahead of me was a bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like old, rotting fabric. It wasn't random. It was placed there, meant to be seen. I didn't stop to examine it. I kept moving, my breathing sharp and fast. The sounds behind me turned into full-on footsteps. They were running now. I could hear multiple sets of feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I was being hunted. I broke into a sprint. My lungs burned. My legs screamed at me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The sounds behind me were getting closer. I knew I had only one chance: get to my truck. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the break in the trees. My truck was still there. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. As I yanked it open and jumped inside, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the trees. I didn't see a face, just a shape, a dark figure stepping back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. My hands were trembling. My heart felt like it was about to explode. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there, and I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. Someone had been waiting in those woods, watching, following, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I was looking for a break from my routine, something different from my usual weekends spent indoors. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been camping before, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted the quiet, the isolation. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from people. I planned everything carefully, packing my gear, making sure I had enough food, and choosing a remote spot deep in the forest. The place I picked was about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a lesser-known camping area, which meant fewer people, maybe none at all. That's what I wanted. I drove most of the way and then hiked the last few miles with my backpack. The path was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a lake. It was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it. I set up my tent near the edge, just close enough to hear the water but far enough to be safe. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean scent you only find deep in the woods. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the cool evening air. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, watching the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky. It was peaceful. I didn't feel scared or uneasy, just relaxed. At some point, I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. I assumed it was an animal. I had read about deer and small critters in the area. I ignored it, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of rustling made by the wind or a small animal moving through leaves. It was slower, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my fire. The noise stopped. It was probably my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone. I stayed up for a while longer before deciding to sleep. I put out the fire and got into my tent. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional sound of insects. I closed my eyes, listening to the stillness. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, my tent completely zipped up, but something felt wrong. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping for long moments before continuing. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. My car was parked miles away, and this spot wasn't easy to find. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Just standing there, I could feel my breath shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound of fabric, someone pressing against my tent. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I took down my tent. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the trail. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line, watching me. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I didn't wait. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and I don't want to find out. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything: work, the noise of the city, and just life in general. The idea was simple: pack my gear, drive deep into the woods, and spend a few days alone in complete silence. No phone, no internet, just me and nature. I had done solo camping before, so I wasn't worried. The location I chose was a remote forest about 4 hours from home. It wasn't a popular campsite. In fact, it was barely marked on maps. I had found it while researching lesser-known hiking spots, and from what I read, it was perfect. Deep in the woods, far from any main road and rarely visited. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed my essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small gas stove, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife for safety. I also carried a map and compass even though I had a GPS watch. I wasn't a fool. I knew how easily technology could fail in the wild. I loaded everything into my truck and set off early in the morning. The drive was long, the last hour spent on a dirt road that seemed forgotten by time. Trees lined both sides, their thick trunks casting deep shadows over the path. There were no signs, no tire tracks, just wilderness. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where I could park. From there, I had to hike about 2 miles to reach the spot I had chosen. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was barely a trail, more of a suggestion of a path, with overgrown bushes and uneven ground. It was quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried away. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. After about 40 minutes, I found the spot. It was perfect. A small, flat clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a slight slope leading down to a stream. The water was clear and cold, perfect for drinking after boiling. The air smelled fresh, untouched by pollution or the artificial scent of the city. I set down my pack and got to work setting up camp. The tent went up first, secured properly with stakes driven deep into the ground. I gathered some firewood, stacking it neatly near the fire pit I dug out. I made sure to keep my food sealed tight. Bears were always a concern, even if I hadn't seen any sign of them yet. As the sun began to dip, I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, some canned beans and rice. Nothing fancy, but enough to keep me going. That first night was peaceful. The sounds of the forest were soothing, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up through the small mesh window of my tent at the dark sky speckled with stars. I drifted off easily, feeling safe and alone in the best way. The next morning, I woke up early, stretched, and started a small fire to heat some water for coffee. As I sipped from my metal cup, I decided to explore a bit. I wasn't in a hurry. I had no strict plans, just time to kill. I walked along the stream, following it deeper into the woods. The further I went, the denser the forest became. The trees loomed higher, their branches thick with moss. Then, I noticed something that made me stop. A footprint. It was fresh, pressed deep into the damp soil near the water's edge. My first thought was that it was my own, but the size was wrong. It was bigger, wider. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. I crouched down, touching the print. It hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever left it had passed through recently. I stood up and turned back toward my camp, walking a little faster than before. My senses were alert now, every sound seeming sharper, every movement in the trees catching my eye. By the time I reached my tent, I felt that strange sensation of being watched. I shook it off. This was a forest, after all. It wasn't unusual for another hiker or hunter to be out here, but something about it felt off. I spent the next few hours staying close to camp, keeping my knife within reach. The day passed slowly. I tried to relax, but that feeling of unease never left. As the sun began to set, I gathered more firewood, making sure to build a strong flame. Fire kept animals away, but it also gave me a sense of security. I sat close to it, eating another simple meal, my eyes scanning the trees. Then, just as darkness fully settled, I heard it, a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, listening. The fire crackled beside me, but beyond that, the forest was still. Then another crunch, closer this time. I slowly reached for my knife, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then nothing. Minutes passed. No more sounds. I stayed up for hours watching, waiting. The fire burned down to glowing embers, but I refused to move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I retreated to my tent, leaving the knife beside me as I lay down. Sleep came in short bursts, my mind on edge. By morning, I was drained. The forest was bright and alive again, but I couldn't shake the tension. I needed to make a decision: stay another night or pack up and leave. I had planned to stay 3 days, but something was telling me I shouldn't push my luck. Then I saw it. Near the edge of my camp, a small pile of rocks stacked deliberately that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, close to my tent, while I slept. That was it. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing everything into my backpack without care. I doused the fire, slung my gear onto my back, and started moving. My walk back to the truck was fast, almost a jog. I didn't look back, didn't stop. When I reached my vehicle, I threw my bag into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I didn't know who was out there, and I didn't want to find out. That remote, peaceful spot I had chosen turned out to be anything but. I drove home, not stopping until I was safely parked in my driveway. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I replayed everything in my head. The footprint, the footsteps, the stacked rocks. Someone had been watching me. Someone had come close enough to my tent to leave a sign. I love the outdoors, but I've never gone camping alone again, and I don't think I ever will. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and the cabin in the woods. I had rented it for a few days, looking for some solitude to clear my mind. I needed the break. The hustle of everyday life had been overwhelming, and I was eager to get away from the constant noise and people. So when I found this small, secluded cabin in the woods, it seemed perfect. Isolated, quiet, and far from any distractions. The drive up was long. It took me several hours to reach the small mountain town where I had to pick up the keys. Once I had them, I drove another half hour on a gravel road that twisted and turned up through dense trees. The last stretch of the road was rough, barely wide enough for one car. The weather had been cloudy all day, and as I neared the cabin, the sky seemed to grow darker. A storm was coming, or maybe it was just the feeling of the woods swallowing up the daylight. Either way, I didn't mind. I wanted to be alone, surrounded by nature, with nothing but my thoughts and the rustling of the trees to keep me company. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as described. It was small, rustic, but cozy. The exterior had that worn, weathered look that only years of exposure to the elements could create. The roof had patches of moss growing along the edges, and the front porch had creaky wooden steps. The place was situated by a small creek, with a clear view of the surrounding forest. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed gently, casting long shadows on the ground as I got out of the car. I grabbed my bags and made my way to the cabin's front door. It was a little stiff, but with a bit of effort, I managed to push it open. The interior was exactly what I had imagined. Simple, with a stone fireplace, an old wooden table, and mismatched furniture. A few old paintings hung crookedly on the walls, and there was a small, well-stocked kitchen in the corner. The whole place smelled like pine and wood smoke, which was oddly comforting. The storm was coming in fast, the wind picking up and rattling the windows. I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. I was glad to be inside, away from the worsening weather. I unpacked my things, set up a small fire in the fireplace, and settled into an old armchair by the window. I had no plans for the evening except to relax and read, maybe take a nap. I had forgotten how quiet it could be out here. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin's structure shifting in the wind. As the evening wore on, the storm outside grew more intense. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the windows. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel heavier, as if the world outside was closing in on the cabin. I didn't mind, though. It only added to the atmosphere, and I was enjoying the feeling of being so far removed from everything. It wasn't until much later, when the fire had burned low, that I started to hear something strange. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me. A thumping noise. It came from somewhere outside the cabin, and it was rhythmic, like footsteps or the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I shrugged it off at first, Probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or a bear moving through the forest. After all, the cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of thick woods. But as the night went on, the sound grew more distinct. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. The thumping came again, followed by a scrape, like someone dragging a large object across the ground. My heart rate picked up a little. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, or maybe some trees shifting in the wind. But the sound wasn't natural and it was too consistent. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the dark. The rain had picked up even more, and the trees were bending under the weight of the wind. I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the porch, where the dark shadows of the trees swallowed up the ground. The thumping continued. It seemed to be coming closer. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, cautiously stepping out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, and the wind stung my face. I shone the light toward the woods, hoping to see something, anything, to explain the noise. But all I saw were trees, swaying and creaking in the wind. The thumping stopped suddenly, and the only sound was the wind and the rain. For a moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine, like I wasn't alone. I hesitated for a second, then stepped back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The wind continued to howl, and the storm raged on, but the thumping sound never returned. I tried to calm myself, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. The next morning, I woke up to a calm, overcast day. The storm had passed, and the air smelled fresh, earthy. I decided to head outside and take a walk around the cabin, hoping that the crisp air would clear my head. As I stepped out onto the porch, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the cabin, right where I had been standing the night before. The prints were large, too large for any animal I could think of. They were human, but there was something odd about them. Deep, uneven impressions, like whoever had left them was dragging their feet. I followed the prints, heart pounding in my chest, until they disappeared into the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in these woods. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area around the cabin, but I didn't find anything else out of the ordinary. The tracks had been odd, but there was nothing else that raised alarm. That night, however, the noise came again. The same rhythmic thumping, followed by dragging sounds. This time, I wasn't going outside. I barricaded the door with whatever I could find. Furniture, a chair, anything to keep it shut. I was sure that whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. I stayed up, the fire crackling low in the hearth. The sound didn't stop. I had never been more terrified in my life. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the fear tightening around my chest. Hours passed, and the noise didn't stop. It was getting closer. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the thumping stopped. I listened, my breath held in my throat. There was only silence, broken by the occasional snap of a branch outside. I waited. Minutes passed, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, I mustered the courage to get up and check the windows. I saw nothing, no movement, no signs of anyone or anything near the cabin. The next day, I packed up and left. I didn't stick around to find out what was really out there. Maybe it was someone messing with me, or maybe it was something I couldn't explain. But whatever it was, I wasn't willing to stick around to find out. I drove away from that cabin, the storm having cleared, but the unease still settled in my stomach. I never spoke about it to anyone. I just wanted to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me that whole time. And even though I was miles away from that cabin, I still sometimes hear the thumping sound in my head, late at night, as if it's following me. I had always enjoyed the peace that came with getting away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. So, when I found a secluded cabin for rent up in the mountains, I thought it was the perfect place to disconnect for a few days. The cabin was tucked away in the middle of a thick forest, far from any major roads. I had heard about the area from a friend, who swore by it for hiking and solitude. That's exactly what I was looking for. A break from everything. The cabin itself looked like something out of a dream, made of rustic logs with a stone chimney and windows that opened up to the most breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. The nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away, and there was no phone signal, which suited me perfectly. I didn't want to be bothered by calls or emails. I just wanted to enjoy the crisp mountain air, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the quiet that enveloped the place as soon as I stepped out of the car. I arrived in the early afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains. The drive up had been more challenging than I had expected, with winding dirt roads that twisted around the hillsides. By the time I parked in front of the cabin, I was grateful to stretch my legs. Inside, the cabin was cozy. The floors were covered with large, colorful rugs, and a stone fireplace dominated the living room. A small kitchen sat off to the side, with a window that looked out over the forest. The walls were decorated with old maps and pictures of landscapes, giving it a sense of history. The place was simple but comfortable. I quickly unloaded my bags and settled in. There was something soothing about the silence here, like the world had slowed down and time didn't matter anymore. After unpacking, I decided to go for a hike to explore the area a bit. I pulled on my boots and grabbed my water bottle, feeling the excitement of being in nature. The trailhead was just a short walk from the cabin, marked by a faded wooden sign that read Raven Peak Trail. It was an easy enough hike, or so I thought. The path was narrow and covered in loose rocks and roots, winding through dense trees. As I walked, the air seemed cooler, the shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower behind the mountains. I had been hiking for a couple of hours, and the terrain was starting to get more difficult. The trail had become steeper, and the trees gave way to a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead. The view was worth the effort. Sprawling forests, distant peaks, and a river snaking its way through the valley like a silver thread. But as I stood there, taking in the beauty, I felt a strange sensation. Something wasn't right. It wasn't a noise or a sight, just a feeling, a pressure in the air. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on fatigue or nerves, but it lingered. I continued up the trail, hoping it was nothing more than my imagination. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller and thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but there was something unsettling about the place. It was as if the forest itself was watching me. After a while, I came across a small clearing with a few large boulders scattered around. It seemed like a good spot to rest, so I sat down on one of the rocks, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The forest was eerily quiet now. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. I glanced at my watch. It was getting late, and I didn't want to be caught out here after dark. I stood up, ready to head back, but as I turned, something caught my eye. It was a faint movement in the distance, just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A shadow flickering between the trunks of the trees. It didn't seem like an animal, more like something watching. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to make my way back to the cabin, trying to calm myself down. The hike down was quicker, but it didn't feel any less eerie. Every now and then, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I had reached the cabin by the time the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. The evening had turned cold, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches above. Inside, I tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation messing with my mind. I made a simple dinner of soup and bread, then settled down in front of the fireplace with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but the unease still lingered. The cabin, once warm and inviting, now felt different, more like a prison than a refuge. Night fell, and I turned off the lights, wrapping myself in a blanket and drifting off to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up in the dark, every little sound making me jump. The wind outside howled through the trees, and I could hear the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound of something scraping against the wood outside made me sit up, heart racing. I lay there in the darkness, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, just as I was starting to relax, a soft thud echoed from outside, followed by another, and then another. I froze. Someone or something was out there. I lay still, barely breathing, straining to hear. There was no way I could go outside in the middle of the night, especially not in this weather. But as I listened, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching on the gravel path that led up to the cabin. I wanted to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place. The steps came closer, each one clearer than the last. Then, the sound of something scraping against the door. I held my breath, staring at the shadowy outline of the door. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, a low creak, followed by a faint knock. My heart was pounding in my chest. I slowly, carefully, reached over to the small flashlight on the nightstand and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, trembling in my hand. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but then I remembered the cabin had no signal. I was alone, and whatever was out there knew it. I listened again, waiting for any sound, but everything was still. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door, moving as quietly as possible. I stepped outside, into the cold, and looked around. The wind had stopped, and the forest was dead quiet. Nothing. I circled the cabin, checking every corner. But there was no sign of anyone or anything. Felt like a bad dream. I walked back to the door, and that's when I saw it. A faint footprint in the dirt, just beyond the porch. I knelt down, running my fingers over the impression. It was fresh, too fresh. I spent the rest of the night on edge, barricading the door with whatever I could find. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched never went away. As dawn finally broke, I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay another minute in that cabin. The peace and solitude I had sought had turned into something far more sinister. The last thing I did before I drove away was look back at the cabin one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw something in the window, a shadow watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin. It had been one of those impulsive decisions, the kind that people make when they're tired of city life, feeling suffocated by constant noise and the pressure to always be somewhere, doing something. I had rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere for a week. It was supposed to be a retreat, a place to clear my head, away from work, away from people. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I drove for hours before I reached it, passing through miles of nothing but trees and dirt roads. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines and a dense underbrush, the kind of place you don't stumble upon unless you know exactly where you're going. When I pulled up to the cabin, I could feel the isolation. No neighbors, no phone service, nothing but nature surrounding me. The cabin itself was small, old, and looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. It had that rustic charm, though, with its weathered wood, a small porch, and a chimney that seemed to be in good shape. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside, the smell of pine wood and something faintly musty in the air. The place wasn't fancy, but it was enough. There was a wood-burning stove, an old couch, a table, and a small kitchen in the corner. It was clean, but you could tell it hadn't been used much. I dropped my bags on the couch and decided to get a fire started before it got too dark. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the thought of sitting by a fire made the place feel a little cozier. The wood was stacked neatly outside, and the kindling was ready to go. I spent a few minutes getting the fire going, the crackling sound filling the otherwise silent cabin. The evening passed slowly. I cooked a simple dinner on the small stove, read a book, and watched the fire as it flickered in the dim light. By the time I was ready to go to bed, the place felt warmer, and I could hear the wind rustling outside, the sound of leaves brushing against each other. There was something peaceful about it, yet a slight unease lingered in the back of my mind, like I was missing something. But I ignored it. It was just my mind playing tricks, right? That night, I slept well. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the quiet was so complete that I couldn't help but drift off quickly. But around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't the sound of something crashing or footsteps, just a vague sense that something was off. I lay still, listening, trying to catch any sound that might explain why I woke up. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the roof creaking with the gusts. But then I heard it again. A soft thump, followed by another, then a dragging noise. It sounded like something, or someone was outside, moving slowly. My heart began to race. I sat up, straining to listen. The cabin was completely still. No creaks from the walls or the floor, just that dragging sound, moving along the edge of the cabin, then stopping. It lasted for a few minutes before I heard nothing. I debated whether to check, but the thought of walking outside in the dark, not knowing what was out there, made me freeze. I stayed in bed, my eyes wide open, listening for any other sounds, but nothing came. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else roaming around. That seemed like the only reasonable explanation. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The silence of the cabin felt heavier now, and every little sound outside seemed amplified. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that I managed to drift off again. The next morning, I stepped outside to stretch and get some fresh air. The air was crisp and cool, and the morning fog was still clinging to the trees. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the forest looked like something out of a painting. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. There, just outside the cabin, was a small, torn piece of cloth. It looked like it had been dragged through the underbrush, with frayed edges and dirt clinging to it. My heart skipped a beat. I bent down to get a closer look. The fabric was old, but the edges were fresh, as if someone had recently been out here, perhaps dragged it from the woods. I stood up, scanning the area. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing that could explain it. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to push it out of my mind. It was just a piece of cloth. It didn't mean anything. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent most of it walking around the woods, getting familiar with the area. The cabin was far from anything, a good 5 miles from the nearest dirt road. It was hard to imagine anyone coming out here. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I would hear a noise behind me. Branches breaking, a rustle of leaves. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. That night, after another quiet dinner, I decided to go to bed earlier than usual. I wasn't feeling as relaxed as I should have been. The idea of being in this remote cabin alone was starting to wear on me. I'd just fallen asleep when it happened again. The dragging sound. This time it was louder, closer. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The dragging stopped, and I held my breath, listening. And then I heard a voice. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was unmistakable. A whisper that seemed to come from right outside the window. "Go home." My blood ran cold. I stayed frozen, unable to move or make a sound. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. I could hear my pulse in my ears, and I could feel my skin prickling with fear. I wanted to run, to bolt out of the cabin and into the safety of the woods, but I stayed still. The voice didn't come again, but I could feel something, a presence, something out there watching me. I knew it wasn't just the wind or the trees. It felt too intentional, too personal. I stayed up the rest of the night, staring at the window, every sound outside making my nerves jangle. When the first light of dawn broke, I couldn't get out of bed fast enough. I packed up my things, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. As I left, I took one last look at the place. The cabin sat there, peaceful in the morning light, the kind of place that had drawn me there in the first place. But now it felt different, empty, almost hostile. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. No one lurking in the woods, nothing that could explain the voices or the sounds. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Something or someone had been watching me, and it wasn't going to let me forget. The drive back to civilization was long and quiet. By the time I reached the first town, I felt a little calmer. The cabin was behind me, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't explain what had happened or why, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never go back to that cabin again. I had never been much of an outdoors person, but when the opportunity came to spend a weekend in a cabin away from the noise of the city, I figured it might be a good way to clear my mind. The cabin was situated deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. A friend of mine had recommended it, claiming it was the perfect place to get away from it all. I had a week off from work and decided to make the drive. I packed my bags with a few essentials: clothes, snacks, a flashlight, and a couple of books. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to get by for a couple of days in solitude. I didn't expect anything special, just some quiet time to myself. I remember thinking that the trip would help me reset after a stressful few months. The drive was longer than I anticipated. The road wound its way through dense forests, with trees towering on both sides. The farther I drove, the less I saw of other cars. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, the sky already beginning to turn a deep orange. The cabin itself was modest, an old wooden structure that seemed like it had been standing for decades. There were no neighbors for miles, just the thick woods surrounding it. The place had a rustic charm, nothing fancy, just a simple porch with a rocking chair, a small chimney, and a door that creaked when I opened it. Inside, there was a single large room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area in the corner, and a small staircase that led to a loft. I wasn't expecting luxury, but I didn't need it. The cabin felt cozy in its own way, and as I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and pine filled the air. I dropped my bag on the floor and started unpacking. The sun was almost gone by the time I got everything settled, so I lit a fire in the fireplace to keep warm. The air outside was cooling rapidly, and I knew the night would get even colder. I made myself dinner, a quick meal of canned soup and crackers, and ate in front of the fire. As I sat there, listening to the crackling of the wood and watching the flames dance, I began to feel a sense of peace. The stress of city life seemed to melt away with each passing minute. There were no distractions, no deadlines, just the soothing sound of the fire. The night grew darker, and I found myself getting tired. I decided to head to bed early. The loft above the main room was where the bed was. It had a small railing around it and a window that looked out over the woods. The view was beautiful, but as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a sense of unease that crept in as I tried to sleep. I figured it was just the isolation getting to me, and eventually, I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night, not from a noise, but from a sudden sense of discomfort. I couldn't pinpoint what it was. No creaking floorboards, no sounds of animals outside, but something didn't feel right. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the roof. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch scraping against the cabin, but as I listened more closely, it didn't quite sound like that. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to hear better. The sound continued for a few more moments before stopping abruptly. I lay back down, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had heard enough stories to know that when you're in a place like this, isolated, surrounded by trees, you start to hear things. The mind plays tricks on you. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I didn't sleep well. In the morning, I decided to go for a hike to clear my mind. I had brought some hiking boots and thought it might be a good way to stretch my legs and get a better feel for the area around the cabin. The sun was up, and the cool air felt refreshing as I set out, leaving the cabin behind. The trail was narrow and winding, the dense trees forming a canopy above me. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped chirping, and there was no sound of insects buzzing. It was almost as if the forest had fallen into a strange, unnatural silence. I pushed forward, telling myself that it was just my imagination. The trail led to a small stream, and I paused to take a drink from my water bottle, resting for a moment on a rock by the water's edge. As I sat there, I noticed something odd, a shape on the far side of the stream. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a figure standing among the trees, just beyond the water. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been an animal or just a trick of the light. But as I stood up and continued along the trail, I felt that familiar unease creeping back. The silence was oppressive, and I began to feel like I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the cabin. When I returned, I locked the door behind me and checked all the windows, just to be sure. I knew it was ridiculous, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. It was late afternoon by then, and I decided to sit by the fire again to calm my nerves. But as I sat there, I heard something else, a soft tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I went over to look, there was nothing outside. No branches, no animals, nothing to explain the sound. I checked the other windows, but everything was still. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I kept the lights on and the fire burning brightly, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As the night wore on, the tapping at the windows seemed to stop, but the unease never fully left me. The next day, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my things and got into my car, driving back down the winding roads, eager to get back to civilization. I didn't realize how much I had been holding my breath until I was back on the main road, the forest behind me. As I drove, I felt the tension in my body slowly release. The whole experience had been unsettling, but nothing truly terrifying had happened. No one had tried to break into the cabin, and I hadn't seen anything I couldn't explain. Looking back, I could only chalk it up to the isolation. The mind can play tricks when you're alone in the woods, and maybe I had let my imagination run wild. When I returned home, I told myself I would never go back to that cabin again. But even now, whenever I find myself alone in a quiet, isolated place, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The woods have a way of making you feel small, insignificant, and sometimes I still hear that tapping sound in my mind. I needed space, real space, not just the kind where no one's talking to you or bothering you, but the kind where no one's around you at all. I was stuck in my writing, halfway through a book I'd promised to finish months ago. Deadlines were pressing, so I booked a remote cabin in the mountains of northern Montana for 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except my editor. No friends, no family. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts and my laptop. That was it. The cabin was tucked into the trees about 5 miles off a gravel road. It was advertised as primitive but functional. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Solar power with a backup generator. A small wood stove for heat, a propane stove for cooking, and a big water tank that collected rain. I had to bring my own food, which I packed into 2 heavy-duty coolers. I also brought a satellite phone just in case something went wrong. The drive up was rough. It took me about 8 hours to get there from where I lived, and the last 2 hours were nothing but winding dirt roads and switchbacks that made my stomach twist. It was late afternoon when I reached the cabin. The air felt sharp and cold. Pine trees surrounded the clearing like a wall. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just one room with a small loft above, but it looked solid. Weathered wood, a sloped tin roof. It didn't feel inviting, but it didn't feel dangerous either. Just quiet. I parked beside the porch, unloaded my things, and stepped inside. The inside smelled like dry wood and old smoke. There was a narrow cot with a scratchy wool blanket, a small table with 2 chairs, a counter with a propane stove, and a wood-burning stove tucked in the corner. A ladder led to the loft, where I found another mattress, rolled up and tied with rope. Dust covered everything. I started a fire right away. The temperature was already dropping, and I could see my breath in the air. Once the fire caught and started crackling, I felt better. I ate a cold sandwich, opened my laptop, and typed for about an hour. Then the sun went down. Fast. No streetlights out here, of course. Just the dark pressing in against the cabin windows like a physical thing. I went to bed early, wrapping myself in the blanket and listening to the wind scrape across the roof. Sleep came hard. I kept waking up thinking I heard something, but I reminded myself, wind, trees, animals, nothing else out here. The next morning, I made coffee on the propane burner, sat down with my laptop, and got to work. I typed for hours. Felt good. The silence let my mind roam, and the words started to come. I stopped only to eat or add more wood to the stove. I didn't check my phone because I knew it wouldn't work anyway. It was the kind of isolation I'd wanted, even if it felt a little heavy on my shoulders. That night, something strange happened. I went to the loft to try sleeping up there, hoping it might be warmer. As I unrolled the old mattress, I heard a soft clunk, something hard inside. I pulled the mattress open. Tucked into the folds of the foam was a notebook, leather-bound, faded. I opened it and flipped through a few pages. It was a journal. There were no names, just dates and entries. The first few pages were boring. Notes about hiking, chopping wood, cooking meals. But as I read deeper, the tone changed. The writer started describing strange things. Missing tools, doors found open, food vanishing from the cooler. At first, they thought it was animals. Then they started seeing footprints, bare feet, human-sized, around the cabin in the snow. No one should have been out here, especially not barefoot in the winter. I closed the journal and put it under the cot. I didn't want to think about it. The next morning, I felt off. Not sick, just unsettled. I told myself the journal was fiction. Maybe someone left it there to scare renters. But I still checked the doors twice that night, and I stacked a chair under the doorknob, even though I knew how ridiculous it was. That third night, I heard something outside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. The fire had gone low. The cabin was freezing. But what really jolted me was the sound. Footsteps in the snow. Slow, measured. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I lay there for a long time, not even breathing. My heart thudded in my chest like it was trying to break out. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard what sounded like someone brushing against the wall of the cabin. I held my breath, waited. Nothing else happened. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting against the wall with a heavy flashlight in one hand and a carving knife I'd brought from the kitchen in the other. When the sun rose, I opened the door and stepped outside. There were tracks in the snow. They circled the cabin. Not boot prints, not animal, bare feet, toes visible, long and narrow. I wanted to leave, but I told myself it could still be a prank. Maybe someone camped nearby. Maybe someone else had access to the cabin. But when I looked closer, I saw that the prints came from the forest, circled the cabin 3 times, and went back into the trees. No car tracks, no gear, nothing but those prints. I walked into the trees, following the trail. It weaved through the pines over a fallen log, then ended at a rocky slope. No signs of anyone living out here. No tent, no cave, no shelter. That afternoon, I sat inside and stared at the journal. I flipped further in. The writer had started sleeping with a knife too. One entry said something that made my stomach turn. He only comes when it's cold. I think he watches from the trees. I don't know how long I can stay awake. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair with the fire blazing, every light on. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no scraping, just wind and trees again. But the feeling was back. That pressure, like I was being watched. In the morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things fast, shoving them into the back of the car. When I stepped around to the driver's side, I noticed something that made my legs lock. The passenger door was open. Not wide, just a crack. I hadn't opened that side since I got there. The seat was wet, like someone had sat there with snow on them. I slammed it shut, got in, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the town at the base of the mountain. There was a small gas station, and I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. I felt sick. I hadn't eaten. I bought a sandwich and a coffee and sat there in silence. I didn't go home right away. I checked into a motel. I needed sleep in a place with other people. Doors that locked properly. Noise. I never went back to that cabin. I told the owner something came up. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't want any part of it. But 2 weeks later, I couldn't help myself. I started looking up stories from the area. Police reports, missing persons. I didn't find much, but I did find a small blog that talked about someone who disappeared in that region. A hiker went out with his dog. Dog came back. He didn't. Search and rescue found no trace of him. Just a line of prints in the snow, leading nowhere. I kept thinking about that journal. Who wrote it? Why was it left behind? Why didn't the owner throw it out? Eventually, I finished my book. I didn't write about the cabin. I never told anyone the full story. But sometimes I think about going back. Not to stay, just to look. See if the journal is still there. See if the prints are still showing up in the snow. But I never do, because something lived out there. Not a ghost, not a monster. Person. A person who watches cabins from the woods in the winter. And I don't think they want to be found. I needed to finish writing my book. I was almost halfway through it, and I just couldn't concentrate at home anymore. There were always distractions. Phones, emails, neighbors, deliveries, even the dog barking at the same damn squirrel every day. I told myself I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from people. So I rented a cabin up north, about 5 hours from the city. I found it on a website for long-term vacation rentals. It looked perfect. No neighbors, no phone reception, no internet, just a single cabin by a lake, deep in the woods. The pictures showed a place that was small but cozy, just what I needed. I booked it for 2 weeks. I figured that was enough time to finish the draft. I packed my laptop, a few notebooks, some pens, warm clothes, enough food for 2 weeks, and a solar charger. The cabin had no electricity and no running water. There was an outhouse and a well. I liked the idea of going off the grid. I wanted to go back to a simple rhythm. Wake up, eat, write, walk, think, and sleep. The drive up was uneventful until the last hour. Once I turned off the main highway and started driving down the gravel roads, the trees grew thicker and the road narrowed. It got quieter too. I rolled the windows down just to feel how still it was. There was barely any wind, just the occasional bird. After about 30 minutes on that narrow path, I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I imagined, but I didn't mind. It sat on a flat patch of land just a few steps from the lake. There was a short dock sticking out into the water. The forest wrapped around the other sides. Behind the cabin was a small clearing with a fire pit and some chopped logs. The outhouse was about 15 feet into the trees behind the cabin. The well was off to the side, with a heavy wooden lid over it. I parked the car, unloaded my stuff, and brought it inside. The inside was simple. Wooden floors, a small table, a bed in the corner, a bookshelf with a few old paperbacks, and a wood stove. No fridge, no microwave, no clock. Just a cabin. There were a few candles and oil lamps already there. I felt good about it. The first few days went smoothly. I stuck to a routine: wake up around sunrise, make some coffee on the portable stove, write for a few hours, then take a break. I'd walk down the narrow path that curved around the lake, just thinking about the story. I'd return in the afternoon, write some more, then eat something simple, canned soup or rice. I kept my food in a cooler with ice packs that I changed out with frozen bottles from the lake. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. I kept a notebook where I wrote down little observations: how long the firewood lasted, how fast the water in the kettle boiled, how long the solar charger needed to fully charge the laptop. It gave me something to do and made me feel a little more in control. By the 5th night, I noticed something strange. It started with a sound. I was lying in bed with the candle almost out, the kind of silence where you can hear your own breathing. Then I heard leaves crunching outside, just once. Then again. I sat up. It was a single crunch each time. Not the kind of pattern you'd expect from an animal which moves fast or makes lighter, random sounds. This was heavier. One step, pause, then another, like someone walking slowly. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, holding my breath. After maybe a minute, the sound stopped. I waited longer, then got out of bed and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was probably a deer. They wander through the woods all the time. I tried to go back to sleep, but it took a while. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I checked the area where I thought the sound came from. The ground was covered in leaves and twigs, so tracks were hard to find. But in one patch, I noticed a strange indent in the leaves, like something heavy had pressed down there. It wasn't clear enough to say what made it. I didn't think much of it that day. I kept writing, trying to push the memory of the sound out of my head. But that night, I heard it again. This time it came from the back of the cabin, near the outhouse. One slow crunch, then another, then silence. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Nothing. I waited maybe 20 minutes, then lit a candle and stepped out onto the front porch. I didn't go around the back. I just stood there, listening. The woods were quiet, not even the usual nighttime sounds. I noticed how still the lake was. No wind, no ripples, just a flat, black mirror. I stood there for a long time, then went back inside and locked the door. The next day, I checked behind the cabin. I looked near the outhouse, around the fire pit, and even walked further into the trees than I normally did. I found nothing. I didn't want to scare myself, but it bothered me how deliberate the sound felt. Not just an animal passing through. It felt like someone was moving slowly on purpose. On day 7, I woke up to find the door to the outhouse slightly open. I always closed it after using it. It had a heavy wooden latch that stayed shut unless someone moved it. I checked inside. Nothing out of place, but still I felt uneasy. I started carrying a hatchet with me when I walked. I told myself it was for chopping wood, but I never needed to chop more wood. There was plenty already stacked behind the cabin. I just felt better having it. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed up with a candle lit, just sitting at the table, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time it was closer, right outside the back wall of the cabin. 3 slow steps, then silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat there, not even blinking. I didn't want to move. I felt like whoever or whatever was out there could hear even the smallest sound. The footsteps never came around to the front. They just stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise. That morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the back wall of the cabin, just under the window, were 5 scratches in the wood. Long, uneven, carved into the grain like someone had dragged something sharp across it. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid, genuine fear. The kind that sits in your chest and doesn't go away. I thought about leaving, but I'd already paid for the full 2 weeks, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a bear had scratched the wall. But that didn't make sense. The height of the scratches was too high for a raccoon and too low for a bear. And what kind of animal makes exactly 5 evenly spaced marks like fingers? I moved my bed away from the window that day. I pushed it to the middle of the room and started sleeping with the hatchet beside me. That night, I waited with the candle lit. Around 1 a.m., I heard something different. Not footsteps. This time, it was the sound of something metal tapping the side of the cabin. Just once. Then again. I stood up and grabbed the hatchet, heart racing. I didn't open the door. I just waited. The tapping stopped after 3 or 4 times. Then silence again. At sunrise, I walked around the cabin and found a rusted piece of metal. Maybe part of an old tool, lying on the ground near the back wall. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up and put it inside. Not sure why. That whole day, I couldn't focus on writing. I kept watching the tree line. Every time the wind moved a branch, I flinched. I realized then how alone I really was. No one for miles. No cell service. No one even knew exactly where the cabin was. I had told my brother I'd be off the grid up north. That was it. If something happened to me, no one would even start looking for days. That night, I didn't light a candle. I sat in the dark, hoping that if whoever was out there thought I was asleep, they'd go away. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they came all the way around the cabin. I could hear each step on the dry leaves. They stopped near the front door. I sat there in the pitch dark, barely breathing. Then, slowly, I heard the doorknob move, just a slight turn. Then it stopped. Then again. But it was locked. After a minute, the sound stopped. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I opened the door and looked at the handle. There were smudges on it, like someone had gripped it with a dirty hand. I backed away and closed the door. That was when I decided I needed to leave. I packed my stuff in less than 30 minutes, stuffed everything in the car, and didn't even bother cleaning up. I just got in and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. When I got home, I called the owner of the cabin and told him I was leaving early. He didn't seem surprised. He just said okay and hung up. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about those nights. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if it was some drifter, a hunter gone off track, or someone who knew the cabin was usually empty. I keep telling myself it was just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. The scratches, the tapping, the smudges, the footsteps. I still don't know why they never broke in. I think about that the most. I had been putting it off for months. The book deadline kept getting pushed back, and I had run out of excuses. I couldn't focus at home anymore, too many distractions. My apartment in the city was loud, crowded, and every time I sat down to write, something would break my concentration. A text, a knock at the door, traffic noise, sirens, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing all day. So I made a decision. I rented a cabin deep in the woods for 2 weeks. It was cheap, remote, and had no Wi-Fi or cell service. That was the whole point. Just me, my laptop, food for 2 weeks, and silence. It was supposed to be perfect. The cabin sat in a stretch of woods up in northern Vermont, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I found it on a listing site. No reviews, but the pictures looked good. Rustic but clean. Solar power with stove, a small kitchen, a bed, and a desk. That's all I needed. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need. Canned food, pasta, rice, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a couple of thick blankets, and a hatchet. The listing said there was a stack of chopped wood ready, but I didn't want to rely on that. The weather was still cold enough at night to make you regret not being ready. It was late March when I arrived. Snow still clung to the shady parts of the forest floor, but most of it had melted. The dirt road to the cabin was soft and muddy. I drove slow. The trees closed in tighter the deeper I went, and the sun filtered through them in thin, pale rays. When I pulled up to the cabin, I felt good. It was exactly what I wanted. A small, single-story structure with a pitched roof, wooden siding, a tiny porch, and a metal chimney poking up from the roof. There were no other cabins nearby, none that I saw anyway. I unlocked the door with the key left under the flower pot, as the owner had told me. Inside, it smelled of dry wood and dust, but not in a bad way. It looked like no one had stayed there all winter. A thick layer of dust coated the windowsills and floor, but everything was intact. I spent the first hour settling in. I unloaded the car, stacked my food neatly on the kitchen shelves, tested the water pump and the small propane stove, checked the solar battery for the few lights. Everything worked. That first night was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that city people don't know anymore. Not even birds after sunset, just the wind brushing the trees. I lit the wood stove, made pasta, and read for a while before going to bed. I fell asleep fast, the kind of sleep you only get when you know you've finally left the noise behind. The next morning, I woke up early and ready to work. I sat at the small desk near the window, facing the woods. My laptop was fully charged. I wrote for hours without looking up. For the first time in weeks, the words came easy. No distractions, no background noise, just the steady sound of the wind in the trees and my own breathing. I wrote all day, only stopping to eat and stretch. That night, I cooked some rice and beans, drank tea, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the stars. They looked closer than I remembered. On the third day, I started hearing things. Nothing strange, just the sounds of the woods, but louder than before. creaks and snaps in the underbrush, something walking around out there. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons. The woods are alive after all. I went out around noon for a short walk. There was an old path leading downhill into thicker forest. I followed it for about 20 minutes, just far enough to stretch my legs. I didn't see any animals, but I did notice something odd. A small pile of rocks stacked carefully beside the path. It wasn't a cairn for hikers. There were no trails out here, and it wasn't just a few stones. It was dozens of them, arranged in a neat little pyramid about 2 feet high. It looked deliberate. I stared at it for a while and then kept walking. I figured it was someone's weird art project. The path looped back eventually, and I returned to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not a howl, not a growl, more like a long, low whistle coming from deep in the woods. It rose and fell slowly, like someone trying to get attention. I sat up in bed, heart thudding. I waited for it to repeat, but it didn't. I told myself it was the wind. I went back to sleep eventually, but it wasn't easy. By the 5th day, I had written nearly 20,000 words. The story was coming together. I felt productive, but I also felt watched. Every time I went outside, even just to chop wood or sit on the porch, I felt like something was just beyond my line of sight. Not a presence, just attention, like eyes on the back of my neck. I told myself it was nerves. Isolation does weird things. I kept writing. That afternoon, I went for another walk. I brought the hatchet this time just in case. I went back to where the pile of rocks had been. It was gone, completely gone. The spot was bare, not even a single pebble left. I stood there for a long time, not sure what to think. No animals could have done that. And if a person moved it, why? There were no tire tracks, no boot prints, no signs of anything. I turned around and started back. A few minutes later, I saw something else. Another pile of rocks. But this one was directly in front of the path. Same shape, same size, but now it was blocking the way. Like someone or something wanted me to stop. I didn't touch it. I walked around it and hurried back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door for the first time. On the 6th day, the noises got louder. More movement in the trees, more breaking branches, more low whistles. Some short, some long. They weren't animal sounds. I know that now. They were too rhythmic. I tried to stay focused. I wrote all morning, but by afternoon, I gave up. I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing out the window. The trees looked different now, like they were holding secrets. I stayed inside the rest of the day. Around sunset, I saw something move through the woods. I couldn't make out the shape, just a figure. Tall, dark, walking upright, passed between 2 trees and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, hatchet in my lap, heart pounding at every sound. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to leave early. I packed everything. I loaded the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to go. But the road was gone. The dirt road that had led me in, soft, muddy, full of tire tracks, was covered in branches. Thick ones, dozens of them, laid across the road like a barrier, like a warning. I got out of the car and tried to drag some of them aside. But they were too heavy, and they weren't broken, they were cut. Clean, flat cuts, like someone used a saw. Who the hell was out here? I backed the car up and turned around. I wasn't going to stay another night. There was another way out. According to the map the cabin owner had emailed me before I lost service. A logging trail maybe a mile east. Rough, but it might be passable. I locked the cabin, grabbed the hatchet, and set out on foot to find the trail. I figured I'd come back for the car later, once I knew the road was clear. The woods felt different now. Still quiet, but not calm, like they were holding their breath. I reached the trail after about 40 minutes of walking. It looked overgrown, but not impassable. I marked a tree with my hatchet and turned back to get the car. That's when I found it. Another pile of rocks, right in the middle of the path I had just walked. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't move it. I didn't even walk around it. I turned and ran. When I got back to the cabin, the door was open. I know I locked it, Inside, everything was untouched except the desk. My laptop was gone. The entire manuscript, everything I'd written, gone. But not stolen, because on the desk in its place was something else. Another pile of rocks. This one was different, smaller, more delicate, balanced in a way that looked impossible, like whoever made it knew how to make a point. I didn't touch it. I didn't stay another second. I grabbed my car keys, got in, and drove over the branch-covered road. I didn't care if I damaged the undercarriage. I just wanted out. The branches scratched the sides of the car. Some got caught in the wheels. I kept driving. Eventually, I made it back to the highway. I didn't stop. I drove all the way home. I never got the laptop back. Never recovered the files. I tried. I even contacted the cabin owner, but the email bounced back. The listing was gone from the site. I checked again and again. Nothing. I haven't been able to write since. Every time I try, I see the rocks. Every time I go for a walk in the woods, I watch the shadows. I don't know what I found out there, or what found me, but whatever it was, it didn't want to be written about, and it made sure I never would. After I had surgery on my knee, my doctor told me I needed a place to rest without stress or movement for a few weeks. My apartment in the city was loud. Constant traffic, neighbors arguing, the usual, and I couldn't focus on healing with that noise around me. My cousin had this cabin deep in the woods, about 3 hours north of town, and he wasn't using it. He offered it to me for a month while I recovered. No rent, just said I'd have to bring my own food and keep the place clean. I didn't hesitate. I packed everything I thought I'd need: clothes, dry food, pain meds, books, water jugs, extra blankets, and headed out early on a Tuesday morning. The road to the cabin got worse as I drove. Started paved, then turned to gravel, then finally dirt. The last hour of driving was rough. No houses, no signs, just endless trees. My phone signal disappeared before I even got off the main road. I didn't think much of it. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The cabin was a simple wooden structure, maybe 30 feet long and 20 wide. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest. There was a tiny porch with an old wooden chair and a faded welcome mat. The door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it was basic but comfortable. Wooden floors, a single bed against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs in the middle, a wood stove, and some shelves with canned food and old tools. No running water, but a rain barrel outside and an outhouse about 50 feet into the trees. It smelled like dust and old pine, not unpleasant. I settled in that first day, unpacked slowly, set up my sleeping bag on the bed since I didn't trust the mattress, and took my pain meds before lying down. It was quiet, so quiet it almost rang in my ears. No car horns, no footsteps upstairs, no hum of city life, just wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. The first night, I slept surprisingly well. The meds helped, but I think the silence did too. I woke up once around 3 a.m. because I thought I heard something outside, but it was probably just an animal. The woods are full of them, and the cabin walls are thin. I went back to sleep and woke up around 10 feeling better than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I'd wake up late, stretch my leg as much as the doctor allowed, eat simple meals, read, write in a journal, and rest. The peace was exactly what I needed. But on the 4th day, I started noticing small things that felt off. The first was the jar of peanut butter. I hadn't touched it yet, but when I went to open it, the seal was broken. I told myself maybe I hadn't noticed before. Maybe my cousin used it and left it half closed. But I was sure I'd packed a fresh jar. I shrugged it off. The second was the chair on the porch. I had left it pushed under the window because I liked sitting there during the day. But one morning, I woke up and it was facing the forest, a few feet away from where I'd left it. I figured wind must have blown it around, though it was heavy wood. Still, I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin my break. The next night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking I heard movement, slow, deliberate steps just outside the cabin. Not animals crashing through the brush like usual. These sounded controlled, measured. I held my breath in the dark and waited, thinking maybe it was a deer or raccoon. But the steps never came closer. They stopped, and I didn't hear anything after that. In the morning, I checked the area around the cabin. The ground was damp from last night's drizzle. I saw boot prints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been outside since the day before, and these prints were fresh. Big, too, maybe a size 11 or 12. They came from the forest, circled the cabin once, and stopped near the back door, which I never used. I locked the doors that night, even though I hadn't been locking them before. I also pushed the table in front of the main door, just in case. There was no cell signal, no internet, no neighbors nearby. If something happened, no one would know. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping on the back wall. Just 2 or 3 quick taps, then nothing. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I waited, barely breathing. The taps didn't return, but I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. In the morning, I looked around again. This time, I found something new. A small bundle of sticks placed neatly on the porch steps. Not fallen twigs, but sticks clearly arranged in a triangle. I didn't touch them. I just stared at them for a long time. My stomach was tight. My skin felt cold. Someone was coming here at night. Someone who didn't want me to leave. I tried starting the car, thinking maybe I'd just leave early, go home and rest in my own bed. But the engine didn't turn over. I checked the hood, battery was gone. Not dead, gone. Someone had taken it out. I couldn't walk far with my legs still healing, and the nearest road was miles away. I was stuck. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. I stayed inside, kept the stove going to make the cabin look occupied and warm, and listened. I kept a kitchen knife under my pillow, even though I doubted it would help. I didn't light candles after dark, didn't make noise, just waited. On the 6th day, I saw him. Late afternoon, just as the sun started going down, I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. A man, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, stood halfway behind a tree. He wasn't hunting, didn't look like a hiker. He was watching the cabin. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, arms by his side, face partially hidden by the shadows. I didn't move either. I just stared back through a gap in the curtain. After maybe 15 minutes, he walked back into the woods, slowly, like he wasn't in a hurry. That night, I dragged a dresser in front of the back door and stacked a bunch of cans on top. If someone tried to come in, I'd hear it. I didn't sleep, just sat in bed with my ears straining at every creak and snap of the wooden walls. I thought I'd go insane from the tension. The next morning, I decided to try walking to the nearest ranger station. It was about 5 miles, according to the map on the cabin wall. I packed water, my meds, a few protein bars, and wrapped my knee as tight as I could. It hurt, but I had no choice. I left a note on the table in case someone found the cabin after I was gone. Walking through the forest was slow and painful. Every step made my knee throb. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that man following me. I didn't, but I felt like I was being watched the whole time. Around noon, I found the trail that led to the ranger station and followed it. A few hours later, I saw the metal roof of the station through the trees and nearly cried. The ranger inside was surprised to see me limping in. I told him everything. He called the sheriff, and they took me back to the cabin later that evening. The triangle of sticks was gone. The prints were washed away by new rain, but the back door had been pried open. Whoever had been watching me had gotten inside after I left. They never caught anyone. The battery was found dumped in the woods a few hundred feet away. No fingerprints, no ID, nothing. They figured it was probably a drifter or a squatter who had been living out there before me. Maybe someone who didn't like people coming into his territory. Or maybe someone just looking for easy targets. I stayed in town after that at a friend's place. My knee healed slowly, and I avoided being alone for a long time. Sometimes I still think about the man in the woods. He didn't break in to steal. He didn't hurt me directly, but he watched. He waited, and he wanted me to know he was there. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not alone. Not even for a weekend. I got what I wanted: silence, peace, isolation. But it came with something else too. Something I can't forget. And the worst part is knowing he's still out there. Last autumn, I took a trip alone to a cabin deep in the woods near the edge of a national forest in Oregon. I had just gone through a rough breakup, and my job had been wearing me thin. The idea of going off the grid for a week sounded perfect. I found the cabin through a small local rental website. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything commercial. Just a simple post, no reviews, no social media links, just a few pictures and a contact number. That should have been a red flag, but I didn't care. I was looking for peace and quiet, and it seemed like this place would offer just that. The pictures showed a one-story wooden cabin with a small porch, surrounded by trees on all sides. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no television. Just a wood-burning stove, a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with running water from a well. I called the number, and a man with a deep voice gave me instructions on how to find the place. He didn't ask for much, just cash on arrival. That felt a little shady, but again, I didn't care. I packed my gear, basic food supplies, warm clothes, a few books, and a flashlight, and made the drive. It took about 5 hours to get there from where I lived in Portland. The last hour was all dirt road, winding through pine trees and thick brush. There were no signs after the first 30 minutes, and no other cabins or houses in sight. I had to keep referring to the hand-drawn map the owner had given me. It had scribbled notes like, "Veer left at the split rock," and "You'll see a tree with a red ribbon. Turn right there." I almost turned back twice, thinking I was lost. But finally, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills, I saw it. The cabin, sitting in a small clearing, quiet and still. There was no sign of the owner. The key was under a stone by the front step, just like he said it would be. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean. The furniture was basic: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a thick blanket, and shelves lined with canned goods and firewood. I checked the kitchen sink and was surprised to see running water, though it tasted metallic. The toilet flushed, and the lights worked. There was a small generator out back, humming softly. That first night was quiet. I read for a while by the light of an old desk lamp, then went outside to sit on the porch. The stars were incredible, so many of them, so bright. There was no traffic, no planes, not even the sound of crickets. Just the wind moving through the trees. It felt like I was the only person for miles. I slept well that night. The next morning, I went for a walk. I brought my thermos of coffee and hiked a little ways into the forest. The trail near the cabin wasn't marked, but it was easy enough to follow. I didn't go far, maybe a mile in, just enough to stretch my legs and enjoy the silence. I found a small stream, sat on a rock, and just listened. The forest had a strange kind of quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I headed back before noon and spent the rest of the day chopping some wood and reading. That night was uneventful too, but I noticed something odd when I went to bed. The doormat was slightly off. It wasn't a big thing, just pushed a little to the side, not where I left it. I figured maybe I did it myself and forgot, but it stuck in my mind. I checked the door, it was locked. Nothing inside seemed touched. I brushed it off and went to sleep. The third day was when I started feeling uneasy. I went for another walk, this time heading in the opposite direction. I wanted to see if there were any other cabins nearby. I didn't find any, but I did see something strange. A pile of rocks, stacked carefully into a cone shape, maybe 3 feet tall. It wasn't natural. It looked like someone had placed each stone deliberately. Nearby, there was a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine. I didn't touch it, but I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. It didn't make sense. It didn't belong. I walked back quickly, checking over my shoulder more than once. When I got back to the cabin, I looked around carefully. No tracks, no signs of people. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. I tried to distract myself with dinner, boiled some rice and heated up canned beans, but I kept hearing noises outside. Not loud ones, just the soft crunch of leaves, like footsteps far away. I told myself it was deer. There were tons of deer out here. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening, At one point, maybe around 2 a.m., I heard something on the porch. Just one creak like someone stepping on the wood. I sat up in bed, holding my flashlight, heart pounding. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I fell asleep from exhaustion. The fourth morning, I walked out to the porch and found something that made my blood run cold. A fresh boot print in the dirt near the steps. It wasn't mine. I hadn't gone outside since the night before, and it was big, much bigger than my foot. I looked around the cabin, scanned the trees, but saw nothing. No movement, no other prints, just that one. I spent the rest of the day inside. I didn't eat. I just sat by the window watching. Around mid-afternoon, I heard something again. Crunching leaves, closer this time. I stayed still. The sound came and went. It didn't approach the cabin. It just circled it. Slow, deliberate. I couldn't see who it was. The trees were too thick. But I knew someone was out there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. Every little sound made me jump. At some point, I heard something touch the back wall of the cabin. Not a knock, just a soft scrape, like a branch or a hand. Then silence. I didn't go outside to check. By the fifth morning, I had made up my mind I was leaving. I didn't care that I had 2 more nights booked. I packed everything quickly. I opened the door to load my bag and saw something that made my stomach drop. On the ground, just a few feet from the steps, was a dead rabbit. Its neck had been broken. No blood, no bite marks, just twisted wrong. Someone had left it there, like a message. I threw my stuff in the car and started driving. The road out was rougher than I remembered. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. After 20 minutes, I reached the tree with the red ribbon and turned left. Another 30 minutes and I saw the split rock, then the main gravel road. But something was off again. My gas tank, which should have been nearly full, was down to a quarter. There was no way I used that much fuel in just a few days. I think someone siphoned it during the night. I finally made it back to the main road and stopped at the first gas station I saw. I went inside, filled up, and sat in the car for a long time. I didn't know what to tell anyone. Who would believe me? There was no proof, no photos, no faces. Just feelings, sounds, a boot print, and a dead rabbit. I never contacted the cabin owner again. I didn't leave a review. I didn't ask for a refund. I just drove home and tried to forget. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I got a letter. No return address. Just a folded piece of paper with 6 words on it. You left something in the woods. That was it. Nothing else. I burned the letter. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone. I still hike, but never too far off the path and never overnight. I check every door, every window twice before I go to sleep. I keep a flashlight and a knife by my bed, just in case. People ask why I don't travel like I used to, why I don't go on those solo getaways anymore. I just tell them I've seen enough of the woods, and the woods saw me too. I was 29 years old when I decided I needed to get away for a while. Life had been wearing me down slowly, just little things piling up. Long hours, noisy neighbors, and that constant pressure in my chest that made it hard to even sit still. I wasn't sleeping much, and when I did, I'd wake up more tired than I'd been the night before. I didn't want therapy. I didn't want advice. I just wanted silence. Real silence. No cars, no phones, no people. I booked a remote cabin in Montana for 2 weeks. The photos online showed a small wooden structure surrounded by pine trees, far away from any towns. It sat next to a quiet river and had no Wi-Fi, no TV, no service. The idea of being completely alone sounded perfect. I flew into Missoula, rented a Jeep, and drove 3 hours northeast. The last hour was just dirt road, full of potholes and rocks that scraped the bottom of the vehicle. I stopped once to piss and looked around at the thick forest surrounding me. I'd never seen anything like it before. Trees so tall you had to lean back just to see the tops. Air so cold and clean it hurt your lungs a little. The only sound was wind blowing through the branches and the occasional snap of something moving in the underbrush. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started to drop behind the hills. It was smaller than I expected, but well built. The wood was dark and weathered, and there was a little front porch with a single chair and a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. No driveway, no other structures nearby, just forest. Inside, the place was simple. One main room with a bed, a small kitchen, and a stone fireplace. There was a bathroom, but the toilet was connected to a septic tank, and the shower was just a metal stall with a thin curtain. No hot water unless I heated it myself over the fire. There was a shortwave radio, probably for emergencies, and a generator out back, which I had to refill with gas every few days. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, just beans and bread. I listened to the fire crackle and sat in that old wooden chair until I got sleepy. I didn't even realize how much I needed that silence until I had it. I slept hard that night. No alarms, no emails, no noise. The next few days were quiet too. I spent my mornings walking along the river, which curved around the cabin and disappeared into thick trees. I saw animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe moose, but never saw anything bigger than a rabbit. I gathered wood, kept the fire going, and wrote in a notebook I'd brought with me. No big events, just small things that gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But then something changed. It started on the 5th day. I woke up and noticed something strange. Muddy footprints on the porch. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but these weren't paw prints. They were boot prints. Human. One set. I followed them from the edge of the woods up to the porch. They stopped at the door, circled once, and walked back into the woods. I looked around, but the forest was still. I stood there for a while, heart thudding in my chest, staring into the trees, but saw nothing. Maybe it was a hunter, I told myself. Maybe someone just passed through. I tried not to let it get to me. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept thinking about those prints. I left the generator off to save gas, so the cabin was pitch black except for the fire. Every creak of the wood or pop of the flame made me twitch. I forced myself to close my eyes. The next morning, there were more prints. This time, they came right up to the window by the bed. I hadn't noticed the night before, but the curtains were slightly open. I didn't remember leaving them like that. The boot prints circled the cabin again, then vanished into the woods. Same size, same direction. No sign of a second person. I walked into the forest after them. The tracks weren't deep, but I followed them as far as I could. They led past the river, into thicker woods where the trees were closer together. After about 20 minutes, I lost the trail completely. It was like whoever made them just disappeared. That whole day I felt off. The peace I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease I couldn't shake. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every bird call sounded like something else. I started locking the door, even though it was the only one for miles. I kept the hatchet I used for firewood next to the bed. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, crunching leaves just outside the cabin. Then silence. Then more footsteps, closer to the front door. Then nothing. I held my breath, not moving. I didn't even want to blink. My ears strained to catch any sound. Minutes passed. Then I heard a soft thud, like something being placed against the door. I waited. More silence. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door carefully. Nothing. No one. But there was something odd. A bundle of sticks tied together with twine, leaning against the doorframe. Not random sticks. They were placed deliberately, about a foot long, tied in a cross shape, like a warning or maybe a message. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell service, and I didn't even know if the shortwave radio worked. I tried it, but it only spat static. I was stuck. I could have driven back, sure, but the thought of driving that rough road in a panic didn't sit right with me. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept the fire going and the axe close. I moved the bed so I could see both doors and windows at once. I didn't go outside. The next night, things got worse. I sat by the fire until late, not wanting to lie down. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, not trying to sneak. Whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. Silence. Then I heard it breathing, not mine. Heavy, labored breathing just outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Just stared at the wall in front of me, frozen. Then something scratched against the wall. A long, slow drag of metal or something sharp. Then more footsteps. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I checked outside. More footprints. More of those stick bundles. 3 of them this time, placed in a triangle around the cabin. All the same shape. All tied the same way. There were fresh scratches on the wood near the window, long, shallow grooves, as if made by a knife. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up what I could, grabbed the keys, and got into the Jeep. As I pulled out, I looked back at the cabin once more. A figure stood in the treeline, too far to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person, just standing there, watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. Didn't stop again until I was in Missoula. I checked into a motel and stayed there for the night with the TV on and all the lights burning. I didn't sleep well, but at least I felt safer. The next day, I went to the rental company and returned the Jeep. The guy behind the counter asked how the cabin was. I told him it was fine. I didn't mention the footprints or the stick bundles or the breathing outside my window. I flew home that evening and tried to move on. But something about that trip stayed with me. About a month later, I couldn't help myself. I searched for the cabin listing again. It was gone. No photos, no address, no listing at all. I tried contacting the site I booked it through, but they said they had no record of my reservation. I checked Google Maps. The location was still there, but the satellite image was blurred. Just a smudge of forest where the cabin had been. No structure, no clearing, like it was never there. I still think about it. I still dream about those boot prints circling my bed, that bundle of sticks on the doorstep, and that heavy breathing in the night. But what gets to me the most is that final moment, the figure in the woods. They weren't surprised to see me leave. They didn't try to stop me. They just stood there watching, almost like they wanted me to come. Or maybe they were waiting for the next person. I was 32 when I decided I needed a break from everything. Life in the city had drained me: work, traffic, noise, people. I felt like I hadn't breathed clean air in years. My job wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either. I worked in an office where people smiled fake smiles and complained about each other behind closed doors. After almost a decade of doing the same routine every week, I felt like I was just floating through time. I needed something different, something quiet. That's when I remembered my uncle's old hunting cabin. He passed away 5 years ago. He was a quiet man who liked being alone. He never married. He spent most of his later years hunting, fishing, and fixing up this cabin deep in the forest up in northern Vermont. I only visited it once with him when I was a teenager. It was a simple place. No power, no cell service, just wood, stone, and silence. When he died, he left it to me in his will. I never really gave it much thought, but now it seemed like exactly what I needed. I took 2 weeks off work, told no one except my neighbor, just in case something happened. Packed some canned food, water, a camping stove, a lantern, batteries, and a small axe. I took my dad's old rifle too, even though I hadn't shot it in years. The plan was to stay completely off-grid for a while. Read books, go for walks, maybe write something. I just wanted silence and space to breathe. I drove up early in the morning. The highway gave way to narrow back roads. The paved roads turned to gravel. Then, after a while, even the gravel ended. I followed a rough dirt path deep into the woods. I remembered the way just barely, using old landmarks. An old wooden fence, a strange-shaped rock, a rusted-out truck half buried in dirt. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the roof of the cabin peeking through the trees. It looked just like I remembered, maybe a little more weathered. The wood had darkened with age. The windows were dusty, but not broken. The front steps creaked but held my weight. I unlocked the heavy door with the old key I had kept all these years. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like dry wood, dust, and pine. The place was exactly how my uncle had left it. Cot in the corner, a wood stove, Shelves full of canned goods, some probably expired. A small table with a single chair, tools hanging on hooks, a lantern and a box of matches. There was even a journal on the table with a pen stuck inside it. I set my bag down and opened the shutters to let some light in. Dust danced in the sunlight like slow snow. It was quiet, so quiet that it felt almost like I'd entered a different world. I didn't hear birds or wind, just my own breathing and the ticking of the lantern as it cooled from the heat of the sun coming through the window. The first couple of days were calm, peaceful. I settled into a rhythm. I'd wake up with the sun, boil water, make some coffee, eat a light breakfast, then go walking through the woods. There was a small stream a little ways down the hill, and I'd sit by it for an hour or two, just watching the water move. I'd head back, chop some wood, tidy up, read a little. I was alone with my thoughts. It was strange at first, not checking my phone or laptop, but after a while, I felt lighter. I even started writing in the old journal. On the fourth day, something felt off. It wasn't something big, just a small feeling, like someone was watching me. I was sitting outside on a rock near the cabin, drinking coffee and looking at the trees. I looked up and thought I saw movement, just a flash, deep in the trees. But when I stood and looked more carefully, nothing was there. No wind, no sound, just stillness. I brushed it off. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. The woods are full of life, even if you can't always see it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cot creaked every time I moved. I kept waking up, heart beating fast, unsure why. I thought I heard something outside, a branch snapping. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just silence again. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up with the morning light on my face and my body stiff from the cold. I found boot prints near the edge of the clearing that morning. Not mine. I froze when I saw them. The mud was still soft from rain the day before, and these were fresh, deep, bigger than mine. I followed them a few steps, but they stopped just where the tree line began, as if whoever it was had stepped back into the woods. My stomach twisted. This cabin was miles from anywhere. There were no trails, no campsites, nothing nearby. Nobody should have been out here. I felt my hands shaking slightly as I picked up the rifle. I checked the chamber, loaded. I kept it close after that. That day, I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept the door open and sat just inside with the rifle beside me. Every sound outside made me tense. The wind through the trees, the cracking of old branches, even the squirrels made me uneasy. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was an old print I didn't notice before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I locked the door and pushed the table in front of it. I didn't sleep much. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, footsteps, slow, measured, crunching in the dead leaves outside. They stopped just beyond the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I just listened. Then came the sound of the door handle turning. Slow, quiet, testing it. It didn't open, obviously, but then there was nothing, just silence again. I sat there, clutching the rifle, heart pounding so loud I felt like it would burst. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but at some point, the sun came up. When I opened the door, I saw the table had been slightly moved, just an inch, maybe less, but I hadn't touched it. Whoever it was, they tried to push their way in. I didn't eat that morning. I packed my bag. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to run. I was scared, but also angry. This was my place, my uncle's place. Whoever was out there didn't belong here. That day, I set up a tripwire using fishing line across the path behind the cabin. It wouldn't stop anyone, but I figured it might at least give me a warning. I also climbed a nearby tree and waited there for over 2 hours, just watching the woods. Nothing moved, no animals, no people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I barely slept again. The footsteps came back around midnight. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I held the rifle tight, finger on the trigger, but they never tried the door again. In the morning, I found something hanging on the hook outside where I kept the old lantern. A strip of cloth, dark green, faded, looked like it came from a jacket or pants. military style. It hadn't been there the day before. I'd had enough. I packed everything up and left. I didn't even lock the cabin behind me. I just left it as it was. I hiked back to the truck, rifle over my shoulder, nerves shot. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. Every sound made me jump. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. When I got back to the road, I drove straight to the nearest town, parked in front of a diner, and just sat there for half an hour, staring at the steering wheel. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just said I cut the trip short because I wasn't feeling well. People don't really understand unless they've been that alone in the woods, with someone out there watching. Later, I reported it to the sheriff's office in that county. They listened, took some notes, and said they'd send someone out to check. But I never heard anything back. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I thought about selling it, but I couldn't. It's the only thing left from my uncle. Instead, I pay someone to check on it every now and then, just to make sure it's still standing. Sometimes, late at night, I think about who that person was. A hiker who got lost? A squatter? Or someone who knew that place better than I did? I'll never know. But I do know this, no matter how peaceful a place seems, you never really know what's out there. The world isn't always haunted by ghosts. Sometimes the scariest things are real people, and they don't need a reason. I rented a cabin last October in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. I had been working remotely for over a year, and between work stress and some personal things going on, I needed to get away from everything. My plan was to spend 2 full weeks in complete isolation. No internet, no phone signal, no people. Just me, a wood stove, a few books, and the forest. I booked the place online. It was advertised as off-grid, rustic, and private, which was exactly what I wanted. The listing showed a 1-room wooden cabin, surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream nearby and a trail leading up a hill behind it. The photos showed it from different angles, and it looked old but sturdy. The owner gave me instructions on how to get there, no GPS, just turn-by-turn directions. It was about 4 hours from the nearest town, mostly dirt roads once you got deep enough into the forest. I arrived in the afternoon. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe a little rougher around the edges. The porch creaked under my feet when I stepped onto it, and the door had no lock, just a wooden latch on the inside. There was one big room with a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. The walls were unpainted wood, and the windows had thin curtains that didn't do much to block out light. There was no electricity, no running water, just a bucket by the door and a hand pump outside for water. There was also a shed about 20 feet away, behind the cabin. It was smaller, maybe 6 by 6 feet, and had no windows. The owner said it was where the firewood was stored, and that I could use whatever was inside. When I opened it the first time, I saw a neat stack of logs, an old axe, and a few tools hanging on nails. Everything smelled like dry bark and old dirt. The first 2 days went just fine. I woke up early, made breakfast on the propane stove the owner left for guests, and spent most of the day reading on the porch or hiking short distances into the woods. The air was cold and dry, the sky clear, and the trees were bursting with color: red, orange, yellow. At night, it got cold fast, but the wood stove kept things warm enough if I fed it every couple of hours. I had to go out to the shed in the dark to get more logs, which wasn't fun, but I brought a lantern with me each time. By the 3rd night, I started to notice small things that didn't sit right with me. The first was that I kept finding sticks arranged on the trail behind the cabin. I usually walked the same short path up the hill to get some exercise, and I started seeing little shapes made of twigs, triangles, squares, even one that looked like a star. They weren't natural. They had clearly been placed that way. I figured it was just from some kids or campers who had passed through before me. Still, it was odd. I stepped over them and didn't think much of it. That night, I was chopping wood near the shed around sunset. I had just set the axe down and was carrying a few logs back when I heard a faint rustling in the trees behind me. I froze, listening. It wasn't an animal. I've been around the woods enough to know the difference. It sounded like footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving in the leaves. I stood still for at least a minute. The noise stopped, I scanned the trees, but it was getting dark fast, and the woods were deep. I finally went back inside and bolted the door shut with the wooden latch. I stayed up later than usual, reading with the lantern on, trying not to think about it. By the 5th day, I was on edge. I kept hearing sounds, sticks snapping, footsteps, distant rustling. But every time I stepped outside to look, nothing was there. I started making circles around the cabin in the morning, checking for signs of animals or people. I found more of those stick figures on the path. Some were new, others had been moved. One morning, I found a circle of small stones placed right at the base of the porch steps. That wasn't there the night before. It gave me a feeling I couldn't explain, like someone had been watching me while I slept. That evening, I decided to skip the wood chopping and stay inside. I moved the table in front of the door and slept with the axe next to the bed. The next morning, I found something that finally made me realize I wasn't alone out there. The shed door was wide open. I never left it open. The wind couldn't have done it. It had a heavy latch that stayed shut even in storms. Inside, nothing seemed taken, but something felt wrong. The axe was hanging in a different place. The logs had been moved, and in the dirt just outside the shed, there were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. Small ones that hit me harder than anything else. My chest felt tight, and I started sweating, even though it was cold. I went straight back inside, packed some of my stuff, and sat on the edge of the bed trying to decide what to do. I had over a week left in the cabin, but every part of me wanted to leave. The problem was, it would take hours to hike back to the nearest road, and I didn't know if anyone was out there watching. I felt trapped. That day, I stayed inside with the axe next to me the whole time. I didn't eat much. I didn't read. I just watched the windows. That night, I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every little noise outside made me flinch. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. It was soft and slow, like a single finger, tapping once every few seconds. I didn't move. I just stared at the window, the curtain barely moving. I didn't want to go over to it. I didn't want to know what was on the other side. The tapping stopped after a while, but I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the axe so tight my fingers went numb. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I was going to leave. I didn't care if it meant hiking all day. I packed everything, filled a bottle at the pump, and started walking down the trail that led back to the dirt road. It was cold and silent, and the deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being followed. I kept looking back. I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time the wind moved the branches, I jumped. I walked faster. About 2 hours in, I stopped to rest and eat something. I sat on a log, took off my pack, and pulled out a granola bar. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. In the dirt right behind the log where I hadn't walked, there were more footprints. Bare feet, fresh, smaller than mine. They were no more than 10 feet away. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just started walking again, faster than before. At one point, I slipped on a patch of wet leaves and hit my knee on a rock. I couldn't put weight on it properly, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, half hopping, half limping for what felt like forever. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the gravel road ahead. I stumbled out of the trees, heart pounding, leg throbbing, and looked both ways. No cars, no signs of life, but I kept walking along it, hoping I'd get lucky. About an hour later, I heard an engine. A truck came around the bend, an old green Ford. I waved both arms and the driver pulled over. I didn't say anything. I just climbed in and pointed forward. He took me to a gas station about 30 miles away, and from there I called a friend to come pick me up. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't even leave a review for the cabin. I just wanted to forget it. A few weeks later, my curiosity got the better of me, and I tried to find the listing again. It was gone. Not just removed, completely wiped, like it had never existed. I still think about the stick figures, the footprints, the tapping on the window. I think about what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. And I think about the one question I never got an answer to: why were the footprints so small? I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I had been working a desk job in Zurich for almost 7 years. My life was stuck in a loop: wake up, go to work, come back, repeat. I used to write short stories when I was younger, but work had buried that passion under deadlines and meetings. One evening, I just cracked. I quit my job with 3 months' pay saved up and decided to finally finish the book I had been slowly chipping away at for years. I thought maybe some time away from people and the noise would help. So, I booked a remote cabin deep in the mountains of Graubünden, Switzerland. It was one of those old wooden cabins with no internet, no neighbors, and a generator for power. I found it through a local website that advertised off-grid living experiences. The photos showed a peaceful log cabin surrounded by trees and snow, perched just below a jagged ridge. It looked quiet, isolated, perfect. I took a train to Chur, then rented a small SUV to drive the rest of the way. The road ended about 5 kilometers from the cabin. The rest was a steep hike, but I was ready for it. I packed light, mostly canned food, notebooks, batteries, some tools, and my old laptop. It was late March, still snow in some places, but the path was walkable. I was sweating and out of breath when I reached the cabin, but when I stood on that porch, looking out into the dense forest and mountains, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. The cabin was small but well built. 1 bedroom, a tiny bathroom, a kitchen, and a main room with a wood stove and desk. Everything smelled like cedar and pine. There was a thick metal latch on the door and sturdy shutters on the windows. Inside, it was about as quiet as you'd expect in the middle of nowhere. No hum of traffic, no chatter, just the occasional gust of wind brushing the cabin walls. The first few days were incredible. I slept better than I had in years. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on the gas stove, then write for hours while wrapped in a thick wool sweater. In the afternoons, I'd take walks around the area. There were no signs of people, no cabins, no hikers, no animals even. Just snow, rocks, and trees. That was fine with me, but by the 4th day, small things started to bother me. It began with the door. I always locked it before going to bed, using both the latch and a chain lock from the inside. But one morning, I found it slightly open. Not all the way, just enough that the cold had crept in overnight. I chalked it up to the wind, even though I knew I had latched it tightly. Then came the footprints. About a week in, I woke up early, around 6, and went outside to gather more firewood from the stack behind the cabin. That's when I noticed them. Footprints in the snow leading around the side of the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, maybe from a day or 2 ago, but they weren't. The prints were fresh. I could see the edges still crisp, not softened by the wind or melted. They were from boots, but not mine. They were slightly bigger, wider. They led around to the back of the cabin, to the window above the sink. Then they disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. I listened, too, but the forest was quiet. Still, I told myself maybe a hunter passed by, or a hiker, or even someone checking on the place. But I knew none of that made sense. This cabin was too far off any marked trail, and there was no car, no snowmobile tracks, no sign of anyone traveling that deep into the woods. That day, I kept the axe with me, even inside. I moved the desk so I could watch the front door while writing. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were uneventful. I started to think maybe I was being paranoid. Cabin fever, maybe. Isolation messing with my head. I went back to my routine, even managed to hit 10,000 words in the manuscript. But then something else happened. I was outside late one afternoon, walking up the ridge behind the cabin. There's a point about 15 minutes up where the trees open a bit and you can see for miles. I stood there, watching the sun start to dip below the peaks. That's when I noticed smoke. A thin trail of it, rising from the trees maybe half a kilometer west of the cabin. It wasn't mine. I hadn't lit the stove since morning. I crouched and stared at it, trying to see through the branches. It was too far to make out any structure, but the smoke was real. It drifted lazily upward, then vanished into the sky. I stayed up there until it faded, then walked back slowly. I didn't sleep much that night either. I thought about hiking out, going back to the car, but something in me refused. Maybe pride. Maybe I didn't want to believe I had made a mistake coming here. I started locking everything, windows, cupboards, even the closet in the bedroom. It sounds stupid now, but I felt like something was watching me. Not supernatural, not fantasy, just someone. A few nights later, it got worse. I was woken up by a sound, not loud but sharp, a thud, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened. Another thud, this time from the back wall. Then silence. I grabbed the axe and crept into the main room. I didn't turn on any lights. The shutters were closed, but I stood near the window and tried to hear anything else. For a while, there was nothing. Then scraping, slow, like something dragged across wood. My heart was hammering. I waited back against the wall, axe in both hands. The sound circled the cabin once. Then it stopped. At dawn, I went outside. There were more footprints. 2 sets this time, both different from mine. They came right up to the walls, then split. One toward the ridge, the other deeper into the woods. There were gouges on the logs outside, like someone had run a knife or rock along them. No other damage. Nothing taken. Just marks. I stayed inside all day. I didn't write. Didn't eat much. That night, I blocked the door with the table and moved the mattress into the kitchen. I slept with my back against the wall, axe across my lap. It was the last night I stayed, because the next morning, I found something that made me leave everything behind. When I stepped outside, there was a pile of stones stacked neatly on the porch. Not random, arranged carefully, about waist-high, and on top of the pile, a strip of fabric. From my jacket. The jacket had been inside, hung on a hook by the door. That meant someone had come in. I checked the locks, still engaged, windows all shut tight, but the fabric was mine, and the door frame had new scratches on it, near the latch. Fresh wood exposed. I didn't think. I just packed. Laptop, notebooks, food, whatever I could stuff in my bag. I left the rest. Took me less than an hour to reach the car, but it felt like 10. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone step out of the trees, but no one came. When I reached the SUV, there were fresh tire tracks nearby. Not mine. They led off into a side path I hadn't noticed before. A path that didn't show up on any map I had. I didn't follow it. I just drove. Fast. Didn't stop until I reached the edge of Che and booked a hotel. I never went back for the rest of my things. I didn't call the police either. What would I say? Someone watched me in the woods? Left rocks and scratches? Took a strip from my jacket? There was no real crime. No injury. Just signs. But I knew what I felt. Someone lived near that cabin. Or stayed near it. Long enough to watch me. Learn my schedule. Come inside without waking me. I think they wanted me to know. Not hurt me. Not at first. Just to show me they could. The cabin's still listed online. Same pictures. Same description. I check sometimes just to see if someone leaves a review. No one ever has. I'm back in the city now. I got another job. I don't write much anymore. Not because I don't have time, but because when I sit down to write, my mind drifts back to that porch. That pile of rocks. That strip of my jacket, fluttering in the wind. And I wonder how long they had been watching before I ever noticed. I had just quit my job 2 weeks before I decided to go off-grid for a while. It wasn't anything dramatic. I just got tired of the same office walls and the same forced smiles. I worked in logistics, lots of spreadsheets, shipping problems, and people pretending to be busy. I had saved enough to take a break, and I needed to clear my head. I remembered an old cabin my uncle used to talk about. It wasn't really in the family, but he'd rented it with some friends back in the 80s during hunting season. Said it was way out near Blackridge Lake, tucked into the woods past an old forest road that had mostly gone to dirt. I found some vague directions in one of his old notebooks my mom kept after he passed. No address, just landmarks and notes. Drive past the 2nd-mile marker. Turn where the 3 birch trees lean west. Stuff like that. It was the perfect kind of quiet I needed. No cell service, no traffic, no emails. Just trees, water, and time. I packed light. A couple weeks worth of dry food, canned stuff, a camp stove, sleeping bag, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and a rifle I barely ever used. It was more for peace of mind than anything. I drove up in my 4Runner and followed the notes the best I could. After about a 3-hour drive from town, I finally found the place. It was smaller than I imagined. A single room with a rotting deck and a door that didn't quite close unless you pulled it hard and kicked the bottom edge. Inside was a rusted wood stove, a single bed with a moldy mattress, a shelf of canned food that had long expired, and a table with 2 chairs. Dust covered everything. Spiderwebs draped the corners like curtains. There was no electricity, no running water, no plumbing. The windows were old and clouded, but intact. It looked like nobody had been there in decades. I swept it out, wiped things down with bleach wipes I brought, and unrolled my sleeping bag on top of the old mattress after tossing a tarp over it. I set up a little cooking corner near the stove and stacked firewood I found in a shed behind the cabin. It was damp, but usable. I lit a fire and sat on the porch that night, listening to the sounds of the woods. Frogs, the occasional owl, leaves rustling high above. It was calming in a strange way. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked around a bit, scouted the area, found a narrow trail that led down to the lake about a 1/4 mile out. The water was still and black in the early morning. A beaver swam near the far bank. I fished a little but didn't catch anything. Back at the cabin, I wrote in a journal, made small meals, and chopped some kindling. Then things started to feel off. It began with small noises at night. Not just the usual forest stuff, but more like movement, deliberate steps in the underbrush. At first, I brushed it off as deer or raccoons. But the second night, I heard something closer, just outside the cabin. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart thudding hard against the inside of my chest. The fire had died down. I didn't move. It sounded like someone or something was walking slowly around the cabin, not running, just one step at a time. A crunch of leaves, then a pause, then another. I didn't dare look through the window. I waited. After maybe 10 minutes, the steps faded into the woods. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, but the prints I found the next morning weren't from an animal. They were boot prints, human, leading from the woods to the porch around the cabin, and then back the way they came. Not fresh, but maybe a few hours old by the time I saw them. It had rained lightly during the night, and they were pressed clearly into the wet soil. I didn't have cell service to call anyone, and there was no town within walking distance. The closest main road was about 12 miles out, and even that wasn't very active. I told myself it was just a hiker or a hunter passing through. Still, I started locking the door with a bar against the frame at night. Not that it would stop much. That afternoon, I stayed close. I didn't go down to the lake. I sat on the porch with the rifle across my lap, watching the trees. Every time a branch snapped, I jumped. Every time a bird took off from the underbrush, I leaned forward. I couldn't see anyone. No more footprints. No sign of a vehicle nearby. That night, I lit a stronger fire inside and stayed awake as long as I could. I didn't hear anything. Not at first. But around 2:30 in the morning, I noticed something strange. The woods were completely silent. No frogs, no wind, nothing. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then came the scratching. It was faint, not loud, not on the door on the back wall. The far side of the cabin, near the woodpile. Just this slow, irregular scrape. I turned off the lantern, picked up the rifle, and crouched near the door, listening. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear the blood in my ears. The scratching stopped. Then nothing. I waited another hour before I moved again. I didn't go out. I stayed crouched until sunrise. The next morning I found more footprints. They circled the cabin again. But this time they were joined by another pair. 2 sets. One larger, one smaller. Both with the same pattern, worn treads, old boots. Not new. They'd walked around the back of the cabin where the scratching had been, then off into the trees. That was the day I decided to leave. I packed up most of my gear, loaded the car, and planned to leave early the next morning. It was already late by then, and I didn't want to drive those winding roads at night. The sun was dipping fast behind the trees. I made a quick dinner, kept the rifle nearby, and didn't light a fire. I wanted the place to look empty, Just after dark, I thought I heard something hit the side of the cabin. A dull thud, not a knock. More like someone throwing a rock or something solid against the wall. I held my breath, crept toward the window, and peeked through a small gap in the curtain. There was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, still, not moving, just watching the cabin. A second shape stood to the left, both tall. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were human. I was sure of it. They weren't holding lights, just standing in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with the rifle aimed at the door, every muscle tense. I heard occasional rustling, but nothing approached again. When the sky started to lighten, I moved quickly. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't clean. I just grabbed my stuff and threw it into the back of the 4Runner. I took the first forest road I could find that looked like it headed east, not the same one I came in on. I didn't care where it went as long as it got me away from that cabin. The track was narrow, full of ruts and roots, and at one point I almost got stuck in a muddy patch. But I kept going. Eventually I hit an old fire road that led to a gravel service route used by logging trucks. I drove for hours before I saw another car. When I got back to town, I filed a report with the sheriff. He listened, nodded, and wrote it down, but I could tell he didn't care much. Said people wander out there sometimes. Off-the-grid types, he called them, sometimes squatting in old cabins. Said if they didn't break in or hurt me, there wasn't much they could do. I never went back. A few weeks later, I did some digging online. Turns out that area near Blackridge Lake had a history of squatters and a few missing persons cases going back decades. Nothing recent, nothing dramatic, just a slow, quiet pattern of people going into the woods and never coming back out. Hikers, hunters, campers. I kept thinking about those old boots. The way the prints circled the cabin slowly. The way they didn't knock. The silence. The scratching. They didn't want to talk. They didn't want help. They just watched. That was enough. I still think about that cabin sometimes, especially when I'm driving alone or when the woods near my house get too quiet. I don't go camping anymore. I don't hike far from the road. And I don't ever go back to places without an address. Because someone, or maybe a few someones, live out there near Blackridge Lake. And they don't want to be found.